All right, good morning, everyone. I'd like to get started so we can stay relatively on time. Thank you so much for coming today, and I have to welcome you to Avery Hall and also to Avery Storm, which has been rather hectic for everyone, and I really appreciate all the speakers who've had some delays, rather significant, but are here nonetheless. So I'm really pleased to welcome you to the school and to begin today's symposium on housing called Acts of Design, New Housing Paradigms in North America. I think before really starting, I just want to extend some thanks also to the Dean for her support for the conference today, also in general supporting the Housing Studio. The studio has been has a long history here at Columbia, and recently we've been traveling, and so that's been a large undertaking for the studio. So thanks to her for that. Also, I want to draw some attention to an exhibition of the students' work and some of our travel that is in the exhibition space at the top of the stairs on the way to the elevator. And so to thank Irene Sunwoo and Tiffany, as well as all the students who put together their work that they've done so far this semester. So that will give you a little bit of a reflection on what we've been looking at in the Housing Studio. And also to Lila and to Lucia and Stefan Bodeker, who have been very instrumental in making this day come about. So thank you so much for all your hard work for today. So a little bit of an overview of the Housing Studio. It is a studio that's been offered at the school for somewhere between 45 and maybe 50 years. So there's a very long history and somewhat tradition at the school, perhaps maybe one of the only traditions. I think Columbia isn't necessarily known for traditions, but nonetheless, we are always looking at housing here in the architecture program, in the Masters of Architecture program, and in the core sequence. So it is the last semester in the core sequence in the second year, this semester fall studio. There are about a little under 90 students, and we have 8 studios, and we all work together on one site, but each of the faculty members looks at a given problem that I write and write a response and lead their own studio section. So we have a very intense semester looking at, in this case, a studio site in the South Bronx. So the studio is very much grounded in New York and the history of housing in New York. This is in a way to reflect upon the history of the studio at the school and also to acknowledge and recognize that across the faculty and all of the different departments that we have here, urban design, urban planning, real estate, historic preservation, the PhD program, and so on, that we have many faculty who have invested much of their careers and their interests in housing, from Richard Plunce, Kenneth Frampton, Gwendolyn Wright, Michael Bell, who's also here today, part of the conference, Reinhold Martin, and so on. Not to exclude anyone, the list is quite long. Also practitioners that have been instrumental in working on housing and thinking about the design of housing, from Stephen Hall to Laurie Hawkinson, and many of our other visitors that come to the school to teach in advanced studios. So I think we're quite strong in thinking about issues around housing, not just in New York City, but around the world and globally. And that has been something that the studio itself has come up against in different capacities, and recently to also think perhaps more carefully about North America, and that's something we've been doing now in the studio for the past 3 to 4 years. The students traveled earlier in the semester to Mexico City. It was our second trip in the last 3 years. Last year we went to Chicago, and are going to be traveling again probably in the next couple of years, looking again at different cities in North America, but we're still thinking about that. This conference then in a way helps serve all of us here to think more critically about the issue around housing and design and architecture. So with that said, I'd like to get started. Just a brief overview. I will be moderating and organize a conference today. I'm also going to be joined by Adam Frampton, who will moderate the second session this morning. He's also teaching here in the Housing Studio and principal of his own architecture office, Only If, and he also works on housing. Kasim Shepard will be moderating a panel this afternoon. He teaches courses on narrative and digital storytelling in the urban design program at GSAPP, and he was the founder of Urban Omnibus, and his first book, City Makers, The Culture and Craft of Practical Urbanism, was published last year. Michael Bell, an architect and tenured faculty member here, is also going to be a moderator this afternoon. He also led the Housing Studio for more than a decade prior to me, and served as the director of the Master of Architecture program for almost 15 years, and will be leading a session with some of the practicing architects that are coming later on. And Reinhold Martin will conclude today's session by moderating our closing panel. Reinhold is the director of the PhD program and also runs the Buell Center here for Study of American Architecture. So with that, I'm going to introduce a little bit the first panel, where we're going to focus on a collective project or a group project, let's say. In part, some of the speakers for today and the thinking of the themes are very much tied and instrumental to the way that the Housing Studio is working. So on one hand, our conference is really geared to the students and that they are working in pairs. So I thought it's very valuable for them to see how not only the subject and its relationship to design practices and architecture, where housing is located within an architectural practice, but to also look at the way in which architects are now working, and in perhaps a particular generation, my generation, working more collaboratively and working together on certain projects. And so with that, we're going to look at a case study, Territorio Gigantes, which is in Aguascalientes in Mexico. And it will be formed, I will be moderator for the panel, but I'm so pleased to have here today Derek Dellecamp, an architect with his own office, Dellecamp Arquitectos, founded in 1999 in Mexico City. He also has recently taught at Cornell. Simon Hartman is a founding partner of HHF based in Basel, Switzerland, and is also currently teaching at Yale and on his own, and his office, HHF, is teaching at the GSD. Anna Fujinier is a partner at Mayo and has recently joined the faculty here at Columbia in coordinating Core 1. And Tatiana Bilbao, who runs her own office, Tatiana Bilbao Estudio, based in Mexico City, has also been a teacher here at GSAPP, as well as Rice and Yale, and has been coordinating and overseeing the project Territorio de Gigantes master plan and organize the architects for the panel. So I think if we're ready, I understood Tatiana is here. Yes, great. And so she will be the first speaker. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you, Hillary, for organizing these. I think it is a project that we've been doing collectively, as Hillary said, and I think it's an incredible opportunity of thinking how can we imagine housing in a very specific context of Mexico. But obviously, I think the issues that we're tackling are issues that could be basically applicable in many, many ways to the whole world, because we're talking about what collectivity means, what a community means, what those ties can make this place a better place for humans to live. And the project started almost probably 5 years ago. And this is located in a city in the center of the country, in the state of Aguascalientes. The city is the same name of Aguascalientes. It's a relatively small city for Mexican standards. It's a bit bigger than 800,000 people. What it is also kind of not standard from Mexico, it's that it's a city that it's very well planned. And it's a city that has and enjoys a specific quality of life that it's a little bit higher in average that of Mexican cities. It's a capital of a small state, but it's a capital of a wealthy small state. But it also shares the same problematics that probably all the cities in the world, housing, how to house all the people there. and how to house it with a standard or good quality of life. So this city is crossed by a power line that divides when it touches the city, and currently, and the government decided to run that line or to subterrane it, and this leaving a big part of the city with an opportunity to be built. This city, this site, basically has an impact that goes to 38% of the size of the city. So we were hired to do a master plan, as I said, 5 years ago. We analyzed the whole city, as this is a project that impacts really the metropolitan area. And we understood the potentials of the site. It's very well located and it's very central to the city. And it is easy linkable in many, many ways, although it's a line and that right now creates kind of a scar in the city, that it's empty, just with these power lines running on top of it. So we understood that we needed to break that limit that this line poses to the city tissue, and we needed to understand how to knit that in order to provide also housing, densified housing, and mixed program in order to try to keep the expansion of the city to the west, to the inner part of the city. There was done a very big master plan that included the whole area. We call it Programa Parcial, which is a special plan of land use and direction of the whole zone. And then we were proposing a master plan for exactly those sites that were going to be liberated by the removal of the power lines. We wanted to create a strategy, as I said, that with the existing green spaces would link this area easily, pedestrianly, but also vehicularly to the center of the city. And this way, trying to erase that scar that the line really imposes right now. We proposed a master plan that included several and mixed uses, trying to fulfill a little bit of those uses that were lacking in each sector. We divided the plan in 4 sectors, and we worked by sectors. We understood specifically the characteristics of each one, and we proposed specific programs for each of them. And then after 3 years of work, the government changed. The government elected a different governor from a different party, and normally in Mexico this means the projects are dead. That's it, end of it. But fortunately, the governor that arrived then saw a big opportunity and wanted to retake the project back. And so he asked us to continue developing the project, the master plan that was in a schematic, at a schematic moment, and at the same time to develop 2 blocks. So we saw it as an incredible opportunity of first developing the 2 blocks and then informing back the master plan. Since the master plan had no rush, we thought it was very important to hold the master plan back and try to think how the design of those 2 blocks could inform the master plan then. So what to do? Invite 6 architects from different parts of the world to do it. We went to the site, and the government decided exactly which of the 2 blocks were needed to be developed. One was going to be developed, the north one, by the government, the housing department of the government of the state, and the south one by the Infonavit, which is the bank that subsidizes and funds the housing in Mexico. And so we brought all these architects to Mexico City for 3 days. We started having first workshops in the table without first going to the site, understanding what could be a collective idea for a proposal for these 2 plans. We put in the table a lot of ideas, and then we went to the site all together. We discussed the possibilities. We discussed the intense relationship to the that this site has to the neighbors and the difficult relationship that this poses. We started sketching and understanding what could happen there, discussing several hours. And at the end, we end up these 3 days with general smaller master plans for each of the blocks. The North Block, developed by Archilab and architects Macias Peredo and Work AC, and the South Block, developed by Moss, Estudio Mayo, HHF, Derek Delecamp, Dogma, and ourselves. And this way, we decided how to create a collective that was designed by everybody, and then specific buildings designed by each of the offices. Then we, each of us went away, worked with our own buildings. We decided to do a checkboard that would allow to bring those combinations of individual projects together. And then we started discussing again, what is that public ground that would give this cohesion or collective idea in this place. We started purposing those plazas and those collective areas, understanding that this could become a platform of equal materiality, but with richness of program that would allow to be literally the platform for those living units designed by different architects, but combined and interposed within each other. And this is how we arrived to the final design. That it's already done. Construction documents are delivered this past week. And I think that the diversity of those designs really allow for people to identify or to be in conflict with the place as much as be in this collective space that will reunite all of them together. What we did, and I'll do it very quickly, the strategy of our own buildings was to understand that we had to build with the buildings 4 typologies, 4 sizes of units, and we decided to use those 4 units and interpose them on different floors to create this idea of progression that the stair would lead you then. A little bit a trick to understand how within this regularity that we needed to achieve for costs reasons would give us the possibility also to create a singularity for each apartment. So a slight difference with a big possibility of giving and encouraging for a better living in this place. Thank you very much.
I'm going to quickly share a small number of projects that have to do with 2 things, like a much larger collective effort, where many of my colleagues here have been also involved, and also the Centro de Investigaciones de Infonavit, who has had an incredible number of initiatives that have kind of united us around these different projects, and also the earthquake that happened almost a little over a year, which, while it was a tragic event, it is also true that it has been a major catalyst force to bring a number of architects to work together in issues of social housing and public space. So 2 years ago, this research center of Infonavit, led by Carlos Cedillo and Julia, who's here with us, did this project called Del Territorio al Habitante. So they asked a number of architects, I think it was close to 100 architects, to design a prototype house for a different bioclimatical case. So we worked in, we had done a number of projects in wood, and we were assigned this house or prototype house in the area of Michoacán, where there is a wood community. And so we designed this more like a structure than a specific house. And then later, Infonavit commissioned Moss, Hillary and Michael, to do a master plan to build these houses, 30 of them, in this place called Apan. And this is just a quick image of their master plan, where they designed the upper building is like the main building that has services, and then this the 30 prototype houses. Later, this is like 3 weeks ago, so these houses are almost finished, and there should be an opening in a few weeks. I'm sure Julia will talk about that. So later they did this competition for this lower lot here that was like the missing piece with the master plan. And the program for this building is a laboratory for materials, which kind of reinforces the idea of this experiment or museum of different prototype of housing. We entered the competition and we won with this proposal. And this is the other major project that kind of brings us all together, this group of colleagues, the one that Diana just explained and that we will be talking further in the kind of the discussion. So like I said, the other really big event was the earthquake. Like many of you must know, there had been an earthquake just 32 years to the exact date. So this 19th of September of 2017, we were hit with this really big earthquake. This is a map. The blue dot right here is where our office is. And the red dots are buildings that were either collapsed or had major damages. The yellow ones are the ones that had a lesser damage. And I'm showing this image to kind of see how close we were to kind of like the epicenter of the area that was most damaged in Mexico. And also because these are two images are just buildings just a few blocks away from our office. And what I pretend with this is to just show how personal it was. And I can even say that it was a life-changing experience for everyone in the office. I can't give us another number, but of the number of houses in rural areas that had to be abandoned, that either collapsed or had major damages. In the later days after the earthquake, through WhatsApp, the number of architects built this platform that was called Reconstruir Mexico. Diana was a big part of it, Carlos Cedillo was a big part of it, and in just a few days we had almost like 150 participants. It was, the energy in it was really incredible. They formed a number of groups that were gathering to kind of structure this effort. Everyone in their own offices were doing kind of like the immediate things that they could help with. In our office, we had so many people from different countries that we served as translator for people coming from abroad to check for safety in public buildings or in buildings. And later we did a team back and kind of figured out where we would take it from there. And we started working with different ONGs and different institutions, which you can see right here, and kind of led us to a further effort down the line. So this is kind of the area where it happened, and I'm just going to briefly walk you through a number of houses. This is interesting because this is kind of like an image of kind of the context where we're working with these houses, really small rural communities that had an incredible damage both in their public buildings and in their housing. So through these ONGs and institutions, we were approached to work with these different families and design this really, really small houses with this sense of urgency. In average, these houses cost around $8,000. And what's really, really interesting is this is an exercise that really makes you work or forces you to work with the most essential elements. Many of these communities have incredible limitations, not only in the type of materials you can have access to, but also with the specialized hand labor. So case by case, you have to work with that community and kind of figure out what makes sense there, what's kind of like the right thing to do with each of these specific cases. So these are just quick images. In this case, for example, these earth bricks are part of the materials that you could get in this specific community. Salvador, this is a moving story. Salvador is blind. This is the image of the house where he lived, which was an adobe house, and all that was left is this door that we then later on reintegrated into the project. Salvador's house, because he was convinced that he wanted an adobe house again, and so we worked in this case with what was available, and these are hay packs. So then this turned into a workshop in a university for other houses to be built. We also did funding for many of these houses. So we really kind of integrated ourselves to this effort in a broader way that had not just to do with designing specifically. These are other of the communities where we designed. Again, this is a project led by Infonavit in this case, in this Oaxaca community area that is really, really poor. And finally, this project, or how this housing effort kind of led us to later on design public space that is related or interweaved with this social housing and collective effort. This is Jojutla, again, another project led by Infonavit. And what was special in Jojutla, I mean, it was one of these places that was really mediatic because of how much of the public space had been damaged. So in this case, Infonavit focused more in the rebuilding of public space than the housing space. So there's a number of different projects here. This is a small bridge that's been commissioned to OMA. There's Alberto Kalach doing a school, and we are doing two different projects with a really close friend, Camilo Restrepo, and it is a church, which is right here, and a community center, which is up there. And very quickly, this is the park. The park had a community center which was really, really damaged to the point where it had to be demolished, which was right here. So we took that as an opportunity to open the space. In this case, get rid of that building up there and open the space to make it public and really integrate it into the neighborhood. And what it is, it's a really simple portico typology that has to do with a grid in the park. This is meant for really simple things like having an ATM, having a tortilla place, and just really like community, really simple community services. And finally, this church also designed with Camilo that had to do with the previous church falling. So this was the late 18th century church of Jojutla, and this was a church that was built in the year 2000. So this one collapsed, and this one was damaged to the point that they had to bring it down. So we were, I mean, in this case, Jojutla is an incredible place in terms of its climate and also its vegetation. So we were immediately inspired by Felix Candela in his open chapel in Cuernavaca, which is just a few miles away from that. And so again, this is an open chapel that has to do with public space, and kind of also what we felt was really moving in this case is kind of like the psychological impact that these spaces have after an event like an earthquake. Thank you.
I was nowhere when the earthquake hit. No, I mean, I'm Swiss, and I think I'm an example of it's doubt. It's a little bit the doubt if you do social housing in Mexico as a Swiss, and I would be happy that this is also addressed today. So we did one little building in Mexico in another group project that was kind of the backpack or the duffel we had. And I show you quickly the images of a guy who came to our office and said, I have no money, but I have a very nice plot in Brazil, and I would like you to do a house. So, which made us think of another project we have done in China, which is Ordos 100, for those who know that, where we had to compete with the situation that 100 different people design a house, and we were kind of brought back to ourselves and did something which is the most simple way to construct spaces, and with the kind of a stupid joke of the roof being our HHF sign for Google Earth reasons. So we had this guy coming from Brazil who said, I want to have a house, I'm a fan of yours, and we said, okay, we cannot really deliver. And I think this is the question here, what can you deliver as architect in a situation so far away? And we said, I mean, one can do with anything a good house. Your name is Pat, and your plot has the size that we can have a Series P on it. And that's what I mean, this is then quickly done if you want. So of course, it's then more complicated than you think in the beginning, but this is this like use the most common way of how to build and give it something special. These are renders. He duly then did that with his friends there and sent us photographs of the construction process, and now it's there, it's built. No? So that was kind of the background we had when we were attacking the question of how to respond to Tatjana's question or the question of that site. And I mean, I don't have to repeat the master plan, but I didn't know if Tatjana would even make it, so I put these images. So this is the site. It's a site which is kind of difficult, neighborhoods next to it with a lot of introversion, but also then we all agreed, we saw it and thought this can be a real neighborhood. It's not about emergency housing. It's just, I mean, how to build a part of the city. And that's why we were also so happy about this idea of just do one and then inform the master plan and not do a long master plan with everything kind of set and then to apply it. So we knew it will be something like this wild mix it got in the end. We knew by looking at other examples, we did research, the question, what can we do? You know, with the question is clear, you can almost not spend money, but you cannot just do the most banal building neither, because otherwise you would have to renounce to the job as an architect from Switzerland. Because if it's just about what is the rule there, then we just spent miles in the plane and money. So, okay, we said what we can do is that we just, I mean, someone picked us for a reason, we maybe don't know why, but we can do the job like we do our jobs, and maybe that is then a part of the diversity of how people attack a question, and this can be like the benefit for the project. We got a brief, and we got the brief with the square meters, and we got the brief with the question of how to fit that on the plan. You see that that's our plots. Even if the checkerboard is very uniform, of course, it creates a big variety of spaces based on the fact that here one is missing, so this one has a different condition here than there. This one is totally at the edge. So we wanted to reflect that in our floor plan on the project. Then we had the second thing, which is that this whole operation is in a slope, which leads to half heights of differences. So we thought maybe we can kind of combine, we do simple houses, combine the entrances to have one expressive moment, like an element which is a big common stair, which is also a social space, and we try to then do something with that. We saw that next to when we drove with the bus, that there is something like a tradition for bigger steel operations in the site, which I think has to do with the car industry there, yeah. So very simple. So we said we can do something special, and we can do something with the floor plan, which as a basic idea is we don't want to have any technical shafts. So each floor, instead of investing in technical equipment, we wanted to have just all natural ventilation. Now I just go through the floor plans and the elements. So this is kind of the program with the smaller housing units in the lower parts, and then the question of how to get these light situations we want. One is with this round stair, the other one is with the square stair. Here you see the more or less, so these floor plans of the most modest parts, which we could do with a double height space to get light, even if you want privacy inside. That's another lower part house. Then we have in the upper floors always this motive of you come in and you kind of find then the light in the end. The most simple way, this is a house which is just next to the site. So here also someone kind of gave his, the views and searching for the views in the sun was the main issue. So this is then how these two buildings operate in the whole. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Ana Pujané. I'm here speaking on behalf of Mayo, an office based in Barcelona. It has been an extraordinary project I think, for all of us. It was a great opportunity to work collectively, but not only that, to design collectively. And as you, and the result that we're presenting today, it's quite obvious how this work has influenced the project itself. So you cannot detach the built form from the urban form and vice versa. And that's a real consequence of this going back and forth from offices to collective discussions and et cetera that Tatiana was mentioning. So our project for Territorio de Gigantes is an evolution of research on housing typology that we have had at the office for a long time now. And it's a research on specifically on how abstraction in domesticity. Everything started with this art piece that it's an art piece from Nicholas Roeg, titled Spook Story Without Characters. And we encountered this art piece years ago, and for us was really attractive by its level of abstraction. So what the artist did was basically to reenact, it's a reenactment of a comic, a Donald Duck comic, and he basically erased all the characters and any text and anything that could be literal, and suddenly everything that was at the back on a second stage until then became on the front at the first stage, and suddenly a certain level of abstraction allowed that any story could happen within the same format. And for us it was really attractive how to allow this abstraction and how to translate that into the domestic. So we start claiming in the office that what we need is actually generic rooms or abstract rooms, so spaces that are not predetermined in it with its domestic program, but allow any domestic program to happen. At that time, it was specifically a reaction to how housing was being built in Spain, that most of our housing stock is defined by and addressed to just one social type, what properly we could call the family type, so based on a structure of mother, father, 1, 2 children. And we were aware that our society in Spain is much more wider. More than the 70% of our society doesn't respond to that social type. So we were claiming to start designing houses that could allow to answer to this wider social reality. Alongside that reference of this abstraction, I've been researching about kitchenless houses in worldwide, but specifically here in New York. And at the turn of the 19th century, there was a large volume of apartments that had lack of kitchens, and apart from that, the apartments were able to expand and decrease. So suddenly the house was understood as a system where the parts could be added and subtracted on demand. And that allows us to reflect on the need also to have a diffuse limit of the house itself. Why our houses have always the same surface, so therefore the same type of space. however, and on the opposite, our social need, our life needs change so much through our lifetime. So how to kind of understand our social needs and start proposing houses that can be adaptable to that as well in terms of surface. We start then to talk about the idea of a diffuse house, a house that can be defined depending on our needs in terms of spaces and rooms, and therefore which limits are not clear and predetermined as well. So we're claiming to have not predetermined program houses, but also not predetermined limited surface houses. The first attempt to put these ideas into practice was in a housing block that we built in Barcelona years ago, where the building had 110 rooms that could be compiled to form different types of apartment, and at the same time, each room was not predetermined in program, so even the kitchen could be placed in any room. At that time, we started working with the idea of big doors, also to raise, even in a stronger manner, the ambiguity of the limit of the room itself. So suddenly just a big, like it's a kind of simple trick, but a big door allows you to connect to rooms. It's really simple, but at the same time, it provides a lot of richness in terms of apartment uses. And I'm quoting all this because definitely for us, Territorio de Giragantes project has been an evolution in this typology. This is our proposal for Aguascalientes, where every apartment has 6 spaces at the same time as generic as possible, and the program is not predetermined. And the doors, we kept on the idea of using big doors, but as we did a really simple move, and if in Barcelona housing block, we built the doors in the middle of the room. Here the doors are just in the corners, allowing a larger possible flexibility of combining the spaces. So all those rooms are subtracted and added in order to allow different combinations. And at the same time, we started to work with the idea of the mistake and the error to raise specificity in a generic system. And we learned that with a project that it was defined by a grid, by a strict order, and suddenly that order was producing these kind of mistakes and outer spaces when encountering a pre-existing limit. And suddenly we realized that thanks to those situations, the order exists. So, and also we start valuing the idea of the mistake as suddenly something that, despite a generic set of generic spaces, allows you to raise certain type of specificity. So in Aguascalientes, we have this kind of suddenly mistakes that allow to be specific at the same time generic. The structure is really simple, looking for, trying to make it as simple as possible in order to make it as economical as possible. And on the rooftop, we talk a lot about, also with the rest of the teams, how to raise collectivity. Not only in the urban plan, but also in our buildings. So in the rooftop, it has just, like 2 simple walls that divide the rooftop in 4 spaces. And our aim is to kind of invite appropriation on that rooftop. So in Mexico, if you have a wall, suddenly you're going to have something built on it. So accepting the idea of appropriation and growth through time, through little glimpses. So for us, these walls, we know that they're probably gonna fence and, like try to appropriate those spaces in the future. And for us, it's accepting kind of the nature of the place itself. And also, instead of designing a simple stair, what we did was to expand it to the point that it's ambiguous in a sense that it's not It's too big to be just a stair, but it's not adequate to be a proper private terrace. So suddenly, this kind of odd device for us is an architectural apparatus that forces discussion and dialogue among neighbors. So in order to fence it, and therefore to appropriate it for yourself, you have to discuss with your neighbor and to kind of achieve an agreement among neighbors. That's why the form themselves, if you look at them, each building has its own form. So for us also, it's kind of an experiment. It's something that we really like from Infonavit, that they were all the time encouraging us to push the boundaries and to propose new typologies and test those typologies for future social housing typologies. And we thought that, okay, let's try different forms in different buildings and as a laboratorium to understand how different neighbors can occupy those odd forms. So we have from really simple ones to extremely big ones. And for us, those terraces are definitely a place in between the most private and the most public, and in between a space that allows to connect the domestic to the urban and to expand domesticity to the urban space. Thank you very much.
I thought it would be good to just have maybe a general discussion about the process of working together a little bit, and also, to talk a little bit more carefully about collaboration in the context of your offices and thinking through the problem of housing. So that's sort of one point. I guess maybe three things we could touch on all together. I think just that a sort of synopsis of collaborating, what that means in each of your practices, because I think all of us to varying degrees have had experience with that. But I think it would be worthwhile to talk about that in the context of also the subject of housing. And because as architects, we're often collaborating with each other, with colleagues, with consultants, but then to also look at the community as a collaborator in a way and interfacing with them at different levels. Would be good. I think I would also like to talk a little bit about issues around public space, because this came up in almost everyone's presentation, and I often reference in teaching an essay by Lina Bobardi, where she writes about houses to museums and kind of questioning and sort of claiming that houses are not just houses, and thinking about housing, and it has to include also amenities. And she doesn't use the word amenities, but that idea of what else informs housing in a more cultural level, that you can't just build housing without that component. And I think in the case of Gigantes, how that is addressed, or how you've been addressing that in your practice. And I guess maybe in just a more direct way, because this is also a question somehow for the students as well, since we visited Mexico City in the beginning of the semester, and we also visited many of your offices, which was amazing for the students, I think, to look at your work in advance and then have the opportunity to come to your office and see how you're working and the types of projects you're working on, but how you, and maybe for this side more of the table, who may have not worked in Mexico before, but what are the takeaways from that experience? So anyway, I'm not sure maybe where the panel would want to start exactly, but.
Well, I can take on collaborations. I truly believe that architecture nowadays must be a collaborative act. I don't understand how to do architecture if not, especially if you're addressing a collective problem. I think designing it collectively will allow for that complexity and even a little bit of chaos on it that could beat those possibilities of more people to identify with a place, to have more relationship with it, even if it's a collective one. And therefore, it's very hard to achieve that when you have one sole mind. So for me, really, architecture has become a collaborative act, and not only as a possibility, but as a necessity. You know? And I think specifically in this project, I think that for me was very important to also bring to the table minds that were thinking about collective housing elsewhere, not only in Mexico, because we often, we know how to operate in our own territory, and definitely we have a certain even more constraints than elsewhere, because really when in Mexico, when you mean social housing or minimum housing is minimum, absolutely minimum. And I wanted to bring those exterior thinkers that would be thinking on collective housing in different places of the world, even as in different contexts as Simon in Switzerland, in order to have that perspective, in order to understand if those possibilities were able to also accommodate in this context. So, well, I do understand that, therefore, giving a collective platform to a response of a collective housing was the key for specifically this project as well.
Hi, my name is Jacen Schleich. I'm Derek's partner, and I think it's really what Tatiana said. It's really true. So we were doing social housing, a lot of exercises before, and we are really already on track somehow in one direction, because we already know how much can it cost, how to optimize the square meters, how to fit everything that it's at the end viable to build. Sometimes we achieve it, sometimes we don't. And with this exercise, having people from other places, they showed us somehow really other approach. They made their effort on other points than we did, and that makes it really, this opens really up the possibilities. And I think it's also the whole idea of this master plan is to show possible developers for all this strip what is possible, and not to do always the same thing. So in that sense, it was really good. And I'm sure everybody struggled a lot with their reality, no? Because of how many square meters. The mixed was really strict, what we had to achieve. The cost was really low. The material palette was really narrow. So all did an effort, but always preserving what they wanted to achieve. So, and I think in Anna's case, that was this collective space of the stair and the roof. And in Simon's case, it was this natural light and ventilation for all the rooms. And I think that they achieved that. So I think it was quite successful until now. We hope that it goes on.
I would like to add to Tatiana's comment about the collective process, or is only collective a way to do. I mean, I think we all struggle. This has maybe less to do now with social housing, but we all struggle with the fact that there is the architecture. I mean, if it just stays long enough, people will have the possibility to come up with their own narrative. No, they get a building is there, and if it's long enough there, then it will mean something to someone. And then in our profession, we try to give a start, no, to a project, make it have a meaning or more of a meaning already by something we pack on top of it, something we give, which is not only the function. And I think this you can do as an individual person, or you can do it as a group. I just think that the individual statement of an architect, of the creator, always smells a little bit difficult for me today. And I think that these group projects have an interesting side, which is it's from the start not about Anna did that or Tatiana did that, but it's a conversation. It's not so absolute. It's about a few people who try to engage in a conversation about what is important now for that project in a specific moment, and that is then already interesting enough that you can refer to that when you live there, when you're interested in that. So I really think that this is what happened between us. We will see then if it's ever built. No, I mean, you never know with these kind of projects, but I think that no one of us came to Mexico with the plan of what to do. No one of us left with a precise idea. And I mean, so in the end, we all had to react to each other, even if we did not do a set of rules more than this kind of checkerboard and what Infonavit gave us as like normal social housing rules. And I think this is really nice to do as a project, but I also think it's only relevant as a prototype and not so much as then a way of how to do a big number of houses.
Could you maybe talk a little bit about, I think more for the sake of the audience perhaps, and because we talked a lot about this with the students, even because they were able to go there, but to see, for maybe lack of a better way to put it, but the incredible design culture that exists in Mexico City, I think, especially right now amongst architects, and that there is a very strong scene there. Just in general, I mean, speaking more broadly and in relation to, let's say, New York, for instance, which has its own set of, characters and concerns going on. I think it would be worthwhile to talk a little bit about that. I think, maybe even I would say my observation from working there with all of you and with Infonavit especially, that there is an incredible intensity and concern about building. And as I think, Derek, you presented, of course, you have situations like earthquakes that are, obviously important to consider and at a wide scale. And but that the investment in building and the thinking through materials and location and variety of different climates, even thinking about the work for APAN and all the different houses that were designed across the whole country, then ultimately had to be reconfigured for this one location, for instance. But the thinking that's going into all of that work right now, it would be interesting to hear a little bit more from you guys about that and observations versus, let's say, other places, because you're also all working in other places.
I'm so always happy when I disagree. I do not agree. And I really think that from what I have seen in Mexico, most of it is bad architecture. No, I mean, what is built is, like everywhere in the world, no? I mean, wherever it's not a special concern. And then there is a scene of people who do good objects, but this is everywhere the same, that this is only a very reduced amount of people who even care about the questions we talk about. And I think it's beautiful that this exists, but I mean, I do not like across the country, and I think, wow, so many thoughtful buildings, but I could not tell you any place in the world where I feel that. So, but I think it's beautiful that this younger generation has the possibility to do. No, it's the same in Switzerland.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean,
well, I think what in Mexico, what is true is that in the 80s and 90s, there were really no architects involved in the discourse or even the design of social housing. No, so it happened very clearly at a time where the rules changed. Two things happened in parallel: the neoliberalization of the economy versus the like privatization of communal land, and the necessity of finding a scheme of producing massive social housing for the increasing migrants from the rural areas to the urban areas, that led to a production of houses that it was just like an industrial production, no? Developers producing boxes in millions, literally 11 million homes were produced in a little bit more than 20 years in Mexico. And I think what is different nowadays is that there is a generation that is involved in the production of social housing by being first critics of the system, and by understanding it, getting in and trying to propose different things, and at the same time being given the opportunity of participating by institutions like Infonavit or private developers as well, that are that it's really changing the scene, at least in Mexico City, and I don't know how it's comparable to other places, but what it is different from last decade to this decade in the country is that, no? That there's a generation of architects with an important amount of interest in social housing and in going in tackling these problematics.
But still, it's only the 1% of
Yes, can you quantify? Is
of
it
everything.
Yeah, but I don't.
Anywhere, no, like you said. So,
Yeah.
but I do think that
I think
in the
Mexico is
Mexico,
different.
tying these two previous commentaries, I do think that there is a generation right now in Mexico that I agree in very little numbers, but yet that has formed a body of work that I think is kind of interweaved or related in the sharpness of how they have answered to a specific reality. And I think that's also true for a generation of architects right now in Switzerland. I don't know if you could consider the same thing in Spain, but I think it has to do with a number of architects having opportunity to build on the public space and on these commissions that have a social impact. And the other factor being that there is like a common vision, and I think that is new to Mexico. I agree with that. Yeah, that was not the case with previous generation of architects in Mexico.
I think it's everywhere the same, but what I value a lot about working in this project and working in Mexico is actually there's a huge difference between how social housing is produced in Spain and how social housing is produced in Mexico, and we know that because we have kind of two projects on the table that are with the same goal, one in Barcelona and one in Aguascalientes, and the discussion and how they're addressed is so different. As I was mentioning in the talk, like Infonavit since the beginning asked us to kind of produce something that could push the discipline further and could push social housing further, understanding the contemporary complexities and how our society behaves. So they were asking us not to replicate all models, but rather to reflect on all typologies and to understand how those typologies should evolve in order to understand contemporary conditions. And I think that that's a question, for instance, that we don't find in social housing in Spain, where most of the program is predetermined. Most of even the law is taken to a point that you can almost not propose anything else than it's not defined by the law. So I think that I think that that's the main difference. So in Mexico, social housing is understood as a tool to kind of have an influence beyond social housing and have an influence on the market and have an influence on real estate developers, etc. So to change housing behaviors. Meanwhile, in Spain, still is not that the case. And
I just think that was only this exercise. In my experience, it's the same as you described Barcelona. It's the same in Mexico. I think this specific exercise is an experiment, and that's why we've done it. But
So fortunate, no?
That's so
yeah.
This
is a prototype of experimentation, which does not reflect like on.
And actually,
the
with
usual
the process of
case
design,
on
like
social
suddenly Tatiana invites us all to design together. That's something that doesn't happen in social housing collection in Barcelona. So you don't have, these collective discussions that through a dialogue and discussion you have like a group of brilliant minds thinking together about how to define something. It's a really generous act.
Absolutely. That's
Yeah,
what
and I
makes it so
would
special,
disagree
but
with you because you are working probably in 5 projects that Infonavit has also asked you to push the limits. So it's not only territorial.
but I see it's the spirit of
habitante,
Infonavit with their research
mejorando la
center.
unidad, is densificando la unidad. So I think there are several projects that they're really pushing limits, even with private developers that you also have worked in different parts of the country that we have worked, and that I think several people that are going to present later on. So I know it is a very small percentage, but I think it is not only like one thing and an experiment. I do believe that there is a difference on what is happening in several offices in Mexico than before, no? Without no doubt.
And I think it's also that's why we are here, because it's special. No, it's not the normal practice. But I think it's also really important to say that I think it is successful, and I hope that in other places people do that kind of experiment, because yes, everywhere it's the same. As soon as it's social housing or it's highly equipped, like hospitals or so, the book of rules of how you should, the manual of what you should do, gets so thick that that you can almost not go out of the box anymore. So this is one successful experiment of how to open that.
Okay. I think we'll be talking about this throughout the day for sure, and as we look at other cities and other examples that are presented a little later. But I just wanted to see if there are any questions from the audience. We have time for, there's a question back here, and Eric also.
Most of the presentations I caught the end of Ms. Puighaner. Yes. Is that the, okay, presentation. So we have huge problems in Sunset Park, as in many other traditionally working class neighborhoods in New York City, where the displacement, the economic displacement is through the roof. Land disappeared into, public land disappeared into private hands in the last decade or so, while the neighborhoods were still asleep at the wheel of what was coming their way. So my question is somewhat not political, maybe, to any of you. While in Mexico City, did you hear the issue of what we would call euphemistically nowadays affordable housing, workforce housing, as part of the political campaign for the presidency? That's my first question, because I'm curious, because we're not doing too well with that here. And two, the housing that I caught at the end of Ms. Puighaner's presentation with the 4 stories and the wonderful.
I'm sorry, I hate to cut you off, but we just have this one question.
Okay, so was that, if I may, was that intergenerational, or it was just one particular generational group?
Well, I think in the political campaigns, in Mexico, housing is a constitutional right. So it is not only in political campaigns, it is a mandate for the government to provide dignified and enjoyable housing for all, which it's never fulfilled completely enough, no? But so it is all the time in political campaigns.
In terms of social types, from the beginning we were all discussing how to address different apartment types, but also how to engage different social types, and that's embedded in all the buildings. So it's not just ours, but in general. You have to consider that also the site is dividing two sides of the neighborhood. One is more rough, the other one is more pacified, let's say. So this and none of those areas have services. So there's a huge lack of simple thing as a bakery, a store, you know. So alongside the kind of the wish to have this diversity of social types, it was mainly also to be able to kind of connect both areas and allow a process of pacification that it was not radical from one day to, but like smoothing things out from and trying to connect both areas that have actually really different realities through placing services on the ground floor, strategically placed in order to allow that connection to happen. So it's not only through different social types, but also through different services that we organize together to allow these two communities to start meeting.
I just wanted to quickly say that this South Block was done by us sitting here in the table, and also Tocoma, who's missing, but Martino Tartara is sitting there. So I'm glad that we are all in the auditorium at least.
Eric, do you want to?
Yeah, hi, I'm Eric Bunge. I'm really interested in the relationship between the master plan, which is a kind of something we're moving away from as a sort of paradigm shift, the implementation of a laboratory of types or prototypes, and the reproducibility, which connects a little bit to Anna's comment about the generic and the specific. So what happens after Territorio de los Gigantes is built? How does Infonavit or the city take this on as a framework? To what extent is it reproduced? To what extent does it become a set of rules? To what extent does it become appropriated even before it gets built? How, Tatiana, maybe a question for you. How do you imagine this would serve as a catalyst?
Well, maybe we ask Julia then, but I think that...
maybe we just build it first.
The idea for it is to become an experiment and to see if really the moves that we did created in this block and then further on in the block that you're also hopefully soon going to start designing as well, would inform what could happen in the rest of the 9 kilometers long of this line. So my hope is that this gets built before we have to hand in the rest of the master plan. I'm really hoping that timing can happen, because it would be very, very formative for the rest of the city if this is tested in a way. One of the lines of the Constitution says that the government has to provide dignified and enjoyable housing for every Mexican citizen. Then that's in the Constitution, and then there's a lot of laws that direct the state how they have to act, but it's mandated in the Constitution.
All right, I think we'll have to save questions for another break, but thank you so much to the panelists, and we're going right into our second panel, and I'm going to invite Adam Frampton to the podium.
Good morning. I'm Adam Frampton. I have the pleasure of introducing and responding to our second panel, which will examine the contemporary conditions of small-scale housing as it relates to domestic living, and the consequence of multiplying that small scale to something larger, to the kind of urban. The panelists will present case studies and histories from Mexico City to show how housing is designed and constructing within this rapidly growing region. The sequence differs a little bit from this. The first up will be Luis Carranza, professor at Roger Williams University in Rhode Island, and also teaching here at GSAPP. Luis holds a PhD in architectural history and theory from Harvard University. His research focuses on primarily modern art and architecture in Latin America, with an emphasis on Mexico. He's published a number of books. Forthcoming in March 2019 will be Experiments in Radical Functionalism, focusing on the work of Juan O'Gorman and others by Columbia University Press. And he's been actually an invaluable resource to have him share his knowledge and his research with our housing students in the housing studio here. Second will be Fernanda Canales, who is an architect who studied in Barcelona, Mexico City, and Madrid, the latter where she received her PhD from ETSAM. She founded her firm in 2002. She received the Emerging Voices Award from the Architectural League in 2018, among numerous other awards. recognitions and exhibitions. Her work has a particular focus on the kind of spaces between the public and the private, or the domestic. And she's also stated her concern for the kind of interrelationship between thinking and practice. So she's also, aside from a portfolio of very impressive built works that she'll show, she's a scholar who's published several books on Mexican architectural history. And finally, Jorge Ambrosi and Gabriela Echegaray will share their work, their office based in Mexico City, founded in 2011. Jorge holds a degree in architecture from UNAM in Mexico City, the National University. Gabriela holds 3 degrees from the Polytechnic University of Catalonia and 1 from the CCCP program here at GSAP. Both partners have taught in Catalonia, now here at Columbia University. Gabriela is currently teaching in the Housing Studio. Their practice has also been recognized in numerous exhibitions and awards, including the Design Vanguard in 2017 and Emerging Voices in 2015. Their practice works across many different types of buildings, but housing has been a kind of constant subject of study. And again, I think like the other panelists, their practice extends into territories beyond building. They're currently the curators of the Mexican Pavilion in the Venice Biennale. So I'll give it over to Luis Carranza first.
This will be a little bit, probably the most different presentation of the whole event, I think, probably, because I'm just going to be focusing on some of the historical examples in, in Mexico City. So the exponential growth of Mexico City in the first half of the 20th century, from about 345,000 to 3.1 million people, and the generally poor living conditions of 40% of the city led to a vigorous and inventive searches to address the problem of housing. The 3 cases that I want to talk about today show how various experiments were developed and how they still influence and are models to how people think about housing in Mexico. They are small proposals or prototypes whose reproduction seeks to address large-scale needs. By solving the problem of the unit in functionalist and economic terms, the architect Juan Legarreta defined how this worker housing prototype could be developed in aggregate. For his architecture degree thesis, he built this double house, which responded to the problem of housing by analyzing the functions, the costs, the use of the house in very scientific terms. He also sought to remove anything that was inessential, such as ornament, and kind of making the house direct. And also by using inexpensive materials such as reinforced concrete, which was not only cheap, but was actually kind of an aid to provide work for the working class. And he also reorganized the social relations that occurred within the unit. He eliminated, for example, privacy in favor of flexibility by adding curtains, for example, as the dividers of the rooms themselves, so that you could, in essence, have one kind of larger space. He also placed the woman of the house at the center and the threshold of the house, giving her central position, but also one of protection and of nurturing. She's the one that, in essence, is the guardian to the house and has kind of views into the kind of the little backyard. Excuse me. And he, of course, advocated for the use of traditional furniture. So this is not furniture that kind of would be brought by the working class, but it was actually kind of spec for the house. The same thing Juan O'Gorman would do. And he was proposing this type of furniture so that the house didn't seem as alienating as it could be because of its radical new forms. The 1932 100-unit communities that he designed in La Vaquita or El Balbuena follow these ideas and these prototypes, except he developed units for work or for retail, as you see here, with this kind of gates that could open up for production or selling of commodities. And then he also developed the units that had this kind of double height interior space, again, to kind of avoid the oppressive sense of environment from these very small and tight contained units. Now, with its standardized unit, which is repeated into a slab, and the slab that then becomes determinant of the city, the second case that I want to address is the Siedlungen model, which was most effectively introduced into Mexico by the emigre architect and ex-director of the Bauhaus, Hannes Meyer. The Mexicans, and this is a proposal for a large workers' housing project that was never built, but the Mexican architects who worked with him in the Department of Working Class Housing would basically transform this model of the traditional Siedlung bar into something different, kind of the component of a new type of kind of model for housing, which was also composed of a slab, but it would be a very different slab. And this slab would try to account for different family types and income types, and you can begin to see this in particular in the way that the section begins to kind of work out. And it also, in trying to transform this model, they were also trying to kind of avoid the monotony that could be characteristic of the Siedlung model, not only in the domestic scale, that of the apartment, but also ultimately of the whole urban planning as well. So Mario Pani, most famously in his Multifamiliares, as we know, basically took from this model plan, as it was called, a series of examples. And I just want to point out that Pani was, in fact, one of the architects that work on this in this project. So specifically, what we see, and these are various examples of the units, we see a mixture of units that in some cases actually spanned multiple floors. So the unit, you enter into one space and you go up or down, which meant that there was a skip-stop elevator system, which is what we see in the Centro de Cupa, Miguel Alemán. There was also different relationships that occurred between the interior of the unit to some types of exterior spaces or exterior courtyards, both that happen in plan and in section, obviously, that allowed for this porosity of the surface that would create different types of balconies, as well as, most importantly, some gathering zones where people could meet and be together, which is something, again, that we saw happening in the Miguel Alemán housing project. Now, what these two previous cases lacked was an integration with the landscape and an acknowledgement of vernacular and cultural traditions. Architects like Juan O'Gorman, who started off being a functionalist in the late 1920s, early 1930s, began exploring the cave house as a dwelling, the cave house as a place to explore art and muralism in particular, to create this total work of art. So O'Gorman is most well known for his the mosaics for the National Library of the Library of the National University, which he did following this experiment. So the cave house for O'Gorman of 1949 was really a type of personal manifesto, something that seemed unique and irreproducible. Now, interested in creating an architecture that, quote, was not based on forms antithetical to humans, the architect Carlos Lasso also explored the morphology of the cave. And here you see some of his kind of early study drawings from the late 1940s or early 1950s, kind of thinking about the way that the cave morphology could create a new type of architectural space, which was a type of telluric architecture, an architecture that seemed to grow out of the ground, out of the place. What Lasso wanted, and he would eventually become the Minister of Communications and Public Works, what Lasso wanted was an economic, efficient, and hygienic architecture. Now, this third case addresses the transformation from what I would call a quote-unquote landscape unit to what we'll see be a landscape housing. So the experiment, the early experiments of Lasso ended up being this house called the Sierra Leona house, which basically was characterized by an exploration of new forms. And this meant that there was a combination of caves, courtyards, which was a typical kind of Latin typology, as well as a roof garden, all integrated into the same building. He also was exploring new materials, basically some chemical additives that would allow the soil to kind of become hardened to prevent from water infiltration, but also they would strengthen the soils. I'm not sure that he knew how toxic those things could possibly be. And then of course, he was very interested in new forms of construction. Instead of creating an additive construction, he started thinking about a subtractive construction, which was not only cheaper to make, but also would create an economic living environment because the earth itself provided for its insulation. So the idea of the single cave house became the idea, as I said, of a landscape housing. This is something that he actually built as the director of the Communications and Public Works in this area in the outskirts of Mexico City called Belén de las Flores. It was a housing project of what he called civilized caves. So in Belén de las Flores, what Lasso did was to create this very large community that seemed to solve or wanted to solve the problem of inhabitation in Mexico. So the community was this very large community on the side of the hill that could possibly become a model for, like different places throughout Mexico. And he has maybe about 30 different prototypes in his archives that he was experimenting with. And this Lasso is standing right there, just to give you a sense. So now this community would have the integration of traditionally designed modern furniture that was actually built by a subsidiary of the Ministry of Education and Public Works. The units were all completely different and had the most kind of modern of services. And as I said, the unit was not only kind of housing, but also had a condition of being a roof garden as well. Now, these cave houses were incredibly inexpensive. They cost less than $5 a month to rent, and that was fully furnished. And if you wanted to buy one, they cost $800 to buy in 1953, which I think amounts more or less to about like $5,000 now. So these three cases that I wanted to kind of show today and to kind of think about represent manifestos, I think, for how housing could be altered and rethought to respond to specific needs of the Mexican people. Their needs for housing and hygienic shelters, but also to think about their culture. How do we kind of create housing that integrates the things that workers are comfortable with, or in environments that they're comfortable with, for instance, the courtyard house, and that perhaps maybe start to kind of generate traditions or rely on older traditions, like, for example, the tradition of, at some point, I suspect we lived in caves, but this is the idea of Lasso trying to create forms that were not right-angled, but something more comfortable for the human beings. And so people, traditions, and culture were all integrated into these ideas of housing experiments for Mexico. Thank you very much.
Hello, thank you. My name is Fernanda Canales. I'd like to especially thank Hillary and all of you here present. I'll briefly present 5 of my most recent housing projects in Mexico that are in different ways based on an attempt to deal with contradictions that are synthesized in this image, the myth of housing. You shouldn't change your family, you just have to change home. And contradictions dealing specifically in Mexico with the social contrasts and economic various situations, but also with the contradictions underlying housing projects, the different desires between individual needs and collective needs, and also between desires and possibilities, or in the specific case in Mexico, between rural and urban conditions. The 4 of the first projects are commissioned by the CIDS, the Centro de Investigación of Infonavit, the research center, promoted by Carlos Cedillo and led also by Julia, that will speak later today. The projects will range from very small scale to larger, and from rural to urban, also from specific to more generic interventions. The first one, Eva House, a house built for a family that was left with no house after the earthquakes, 2017. It's the same model that Derek presented for a community in Oquilan, a 2-hour drive from Mexico City, a house that has to cost around $8,000 and has to be built in 2 months. We're just about to finish it. The idea here was to provide Eva a house with 3 bedrooms. She used to live, as many of the people in the same area, the whole family lived in a single-room house where they cooked, slept, even have different partners or children of different sexes from different parents. So the idea was first to provide individual bedrooms. The prototype A with 3 bedrooms and double height area to provide this space for also communal space for cooking, living and dining area, and with different solutions to reply the same structure, the same frame, with 1 bedroom working space or even a terrace or an open patio. This is the solution that's being built with a water deposit just above the bathroom, very economic, simple solution, but also thinking of how this same prototype can be replied and multiplied, become a community, built with self-built production. We're building the bricks, earth bricks, and we're almost finished. This second project deals with the same idea of how a very single unit can grow, a house that grows with the family needs. The first prototype A, just a single bedroom, and then the living and cooking area separate from the house in order to play with the separation of the 2 units and providing a patio or different ways to grow at the rooftops. This is the ground level where you have the very basic unit, and also providing 2 or 3 bedrooms for the grandmother or different newlywed daughter or whatever different family needs, and also providing working space or storage for the crops. And then how you can shift volumes and provide patios, because most of the families are used to cooking outside, or they're also used to having the bathroom outside. So it's different typologies, the same structure. And it's also thought to be a self-built with different materials. And this third project, the Casa Productiva, depends on the very basic unit, 25 square meters, and how you can provide a growing house, also changing the typology, different solutions for 1 bedroom, 2 bedrooms, and working space. You can have a tapanco, which is a double height, and this double height solution has to do with reusing rainwater and having the bathroom and the kitchen just directly below the water deposit. Also thought to be built with different materials, ranging from adobe to block or even hay, and forming a community also. This project is being built now, 2 prototypes in Apan. It's the same project that Derek also showed. We're almost finishing the houses. And this is a 4th project thought of with the same concepts of the 3rd projects before, but with the logic of redensification, taking abandoned housing and providing the same idea of houses that can grow even within a vertical solution. So you have minimum housing with the possibility of growing, of extending a new room, or even copying the house, mirroring the apartment building. So you can use the vertical and the services, the stairs, to provide a more economic situation. And this 5th project, Portales Housing, this is in the urban condition in Mexico City. It's a building for 12 apartments. They range from 50 square meters up to 70 square meters, and they all have different possibilities of extending the dwelling to the outside, either with a patio, a small balcony, or a double-height apartments in the upper floor with the terraces on top. And in this apartment, the hallways and the corridors are all open spaces. They take advantage of the climate in Mexico City. So they extend to small patios, to balconies, or to terraces, providing also communal areas and small spaces to extend the living areas. This project is Montalban Housing. We're about to finish it this spring. It's 24 apartments and also with commercial space extending to the street. It's a very long volume, but it opens up with different patios, different balconies. And the idea here is to provide different typologies ranging from 50 square meters, 3 bedrooms, up to solutions just with 1 bedroom or working spaces. So you have the diversity. In a way, I think all of these projects connect with the same idea of providing diversity within a unitary structure. So you have 1 bedroom, you have commerce, and you have always patios or balconies to extend the dwellings. This is the solution. You also have the rooftops and double-height duplex housing in the upper floors. This is the 7th project. It's an utopian proposal. It deals with a problem in Mexico that we have more than 5 million abandoned houses. Mexico, for one part, is one of the countries with more scarcity of housing, but it is also one of the places with more abandoned housing. They're mostly new housing built in the peripheries, built 3 or 4 hours away from working areas or from schools with no links to public transport, no services. So the idea of this project is to take the abandoned houses and build structures just on top of them to provide all of the lacking services. So you take the dwellings and build on top everything that they're missing from working spaces, recreational areas, and links to public transport. In the past 30 years, the population in Mexico City has grown 40%, but the territorial expansion has been of more than 260%. So, you know, we're growing just to sell more, extend more, buy more, but not actually related to the needs, not even to population growth. So we have this millions of abandoned houses. So there's a proposal what to do with those areas instead of just continue to grow, extend horizontally. So the idea is to provide with the existing structures something else. And this last project, I think in a way it relates with Luis Carranza's idea of the more organic house or landscape housing. It's a single family dwelling, but the idea of the client was to invite, it's for a weekend house in 2 hours from Mexico City. The idea of the client was to always have guests, always invite, so it's a house for more than 2 or 3 families at the time, that they could have a private space but also shared common areas. So in a way, I think it relates, even though it's a completely different budget and size, in a way it relates to the first projects in the sense of you have a single dwelling that can be multiplied and have then a communal space in the center. So you have 9 different volumes comprising different areas. It's like either large bedrooms or small houses just put together around the central courtyard. And you have a house that in a way deals with these different gradients between the public, semi-public, private, or completely private. And they open up to different views, depending as well as the first projects on climate issues and on orientation. So you have the different volumes, and how can you sum up the different private needs, or actually thinking about the consequences of private needs in a collective territory or in a common land. So thank you very much.
Hello, thank you, Hilary, for organizing the symposium, and Adam for the presentation. As an architectural firm based in Mexico City, when we think about housing, we think in urban environments. We don't understand housing something to be in rural areas. We are used to understand housing in these urban environments. And Mexico has a great heritage about housing. We have great examples from the 20th century that were projects guided by architects and institutions in a kind of collaboration that works really well for a lot of years. After that, we have some more serious projects that were not guided by architects, but more by political decisions and economic interests. So I don't want to talk about this in specific, but because what we want to address here is that to understand that housing as a typology is one of the richest representation of the history of a cultural evolution in a city. So understanding that, we want to share with you not some specific projects, but more the questions that we have to address or that we have to confront every time that we are trying to design a project in this kind of environment. So when we're thinking of these urban environments, the first thing that we're dealing with is the idea of substitution. Because when we are arriving to a new housing project, what we have to do is what is that we are going to replace. And something awkward is that normally when we are talking about housing, what we are replacing in small-scale projects like in Mexico City, is we are replacing houses. So here what we want to really focus on is to understand what is being lost. What is that in this replacement action, it's been erased from the city, and what can we do as architects to start keeping that from disappear? Because at the end, all these projects are based in this persistence. Some of them have historical heritage. Some of them are just regular buildings that could be just like demolished. But at the end, with the thing that we are dealing is that all these houses are representations of manners of inhabiting that have been created on the city for maybe quite a lot of years. And that thing is something that could not be just replaced by a new housing project. The new housing project has to address and need to have the possibility to offer the opportunity to understand this domesticity and to multiply and to reply that and try to allocate these manners of inhabiting. So when we thought about this domesticity and these manners of inhabiting that exist in the city, it can be represented in very different ways. And in the history and tradition of housing in Mexico, there are a lot of examples of these different kinds of domesticity. So maybe just the scale of proportion of a space could address this idea of domesticity. But maybe some other issues, like in Mexico City, because of the mild weather, the relation with exterior spaces and how in the house we are relating with exterior, it's something that has a lot to do with the manner of living, the ways that people are used to live in their houses. And it's something that cannot be changed so easily, because this way that the house is related with exterior has not just to do with the relation interior-exterior, it has also to do with the perception of the space, because, for example, if it's a courtyard where the house is uses to get the light, all the perception of the space is about this pouring of light through a patio. So it's something that it could be kept somehow, and we want to explore in this exercise of projects of the office these ideas of how people are used to live on those kind of spaces. Another way that domesticity could be expressed is how did an apartment building or how did a house it's addressing the problem of privacy and how this privacy is related with the city. And not just talking about privacy in terms of the private space or the the private property, but also privacy in terms of the public space, a public privacy that could be taken off in public spaces that you feel privacy and you feel contained spaces that allow you and give you the opportunity to have spaces for silence, that it's also something about manners of inhabiting. Or maybe domesticity could be also a way to understand the rituals. Rituals as simple as to be standing up in a portico watching toward the streets. And there's a lot of typologies in Mexico that has to do with this idea. So this idea of domesticity is also a tradition, and it's something, again, that could not be just erased. It's something that has to be like preserved, or at least give the opportunity to have a continuity or a transformation during the process of time. So to work with these possibilities to create different kinds of domesticity, we think that the alternative, the exploration of different typologies in architecture, it's very important for us, because through them we can find or search for different ways to give opportunity to the new housings to express this different kind of domesticity. And that exploration of typology gives us the opportunity to rethink or to redefine concepts as simple as how to solve an apartment building in a corner of two main streets. But also it gives us the chance to maybe explore the idea of the patio house and how could it be transformed into an apartment building. Or maybe also how to reinterpret this idea of the classical tenement housing building that is very popular in some neighborhoods in Mexico City, and how could that also become a new housing building, trying to preserve this idea of the tenement housing. And also explore, for example, ideas on how could a grid could just offer different possibilities of inhabiting these specific grids with complete different kind of size of apartments, configuration of apartments, but always trying to explore this idea of the grid also like a typology. And also the idea of the portico, again, like a typology, the house with a portico that is very common in some rural areas in Mexico City, and how could that portico become a building like itself, a building with porticos. So apart from that, from these explorations of typology, the other concept or concern that we normally are focusing on in the development of this project is this idea of integrity. And when we talk about integrity, we normally talk about structural simplicity and economy of means, because it starts approaching to the topic of ethics in our case. Because what we think is that when we are trying to build something in Mexico City, the most complicated thing, Derek's already explained the things and the problem that we have with earthquakes, is that any construction in Mexico City already have an overcost, because all the effort that we need to do in structures to resist the earthquake. So normally structures had to be simple just because of that, because the structure by itself it's already too expensive to be affordable in houses. So we cannot explore and we cannot start to invent things in structural meanings, because what we want to do is to maintain the cost of the structure the lower as possible. So what we believe in this thing of integrity is how could this structure become part of the facade, and how did every element that you put on your building it work in a structural way. It's not a way of designing facades, but it's everything working. So in this case, for example, the grid of columns, it's combined with all the shearing walls that are working and are taking the efforts for the earthquake. So all the building, all the elements in this kind of facade is working precisely to resist earthquakes and to support the building. Or maybe also talking about integrity, understanding the void that conforms not just the patio on these patio houses, but also the void that is inside the house and how these two voids are relating. So the integrity of the building became both the interior and the exterior space, like one complete space that just flows from inside to outside. Or maybe in this idea of the grid expressed to the city like this way, also again like an integrity structure that is just what it looks like. It's a grid, and inside the same grid is expressed in all the apartments, just to be coherent and to try to make the less elements possible towards the streets and toward the facade. And in some different cases, maybe the corridors is the element that in this tenement housing, it's trying to create this integrity through all the project, and how this corridor is expressed also in interior space of the project. Or maybe again, in this project about the porticos, also how those porticos became the building, and the structure, it's everything that you see, and there's no like second elements that are not working in the structural way for the project. And maybe the last thing that we are starting to be concerned of, as some of our other colleagues already mentioned, is that Mexico has addressed this idea of collectivity in the last years, because the 20 previous years, maybe there was no thinking in architecture in these kind of ways. And Infonavit is one of the institutions that have create this kind of opportunities to rethink again the idea of collectivity. And maybe in a kind of in a way to critique our own work, it's what we were presenting here has to do more with redensification of a city, creating from a house maybe a multiple house. It's an exercise of multiplication, but it's not yet a problem of collectiveness. It's just about redensification. Thank you very much.
Presentations, really amazing, kind of impressive work. One thing that kind of strikes me about the many projects that have been shown from the kind of early examples of kind of modernist experimentation is this idea that I think Luis brought up in the Juan Legarreta's projects, that the forsaking kind of privacy for flexibility. And maybe in a way how that kind of, in a lot of Fernanda's projects, this idea of the kind of, the sort of invention, the territory for invention is kind of within these kind of communal spaces, the hallways, the spaces between the threshold, between the kind of the private space and the sort of city on the balconies, and the you know, growth, the kind of indeterminate growth of the kind of projects, and I think in maybe less so Gabriela and Jorge in your projects, but there is also this kind of expression of the, you know, within these kind of frames, the sort of infill, the incremental infill of windows. I know that it's not growth per se, but perhaps the kind of expression of these of this kind of informality or indeterminacy, and so I feel like that's somehow. Perhaps a kind of theme or connection, maybe not, between all these kind of projects, and I wonder how much of that comes from the idea of the kind of the rapidly expanding kind of city and the growth of, you know, population, but also kind of footprints that Fernanda mentioned. How much of that? I mean, I think it was really interesting that Jorge, you mentioned like how. In a way, because structure, the area for invention can't really be within kind of structure or material. I know that Fernanda, also a lot of your work is in concrete, basically, even though you showed other materials. So I'm curious, like how or where you see, and so it's a kind of question maybe for any or all of you, you know, how much you see your projects as through the kind of lens of growth, maybe?
For me, completely, because it has to do with resources, with limited resources always. For example, if you have just the money to build a 50 square meter, this is 50 square meters, so if you take 25 and 25, instead of doing a house that's just this, if you do the house that's this, then you have another area that is also part of your house. And this space can extend to this courtyard, and this one can do that as well. So you have a house that can measure up to 100 square meters, 120 depending. I mean, land in rural areas is really cheap. They don't even have to buy it, so they just occupy it. So then you can extend the house and maybe just put a temporary covering or a rooftop or whatever, really simple, and having the possibility of extending the house through time. So That's the case for rural areas, which is really different from urban areas where land is really expensive. So you have the opposite. You have to grow in the same space. So that's why I think Jorge explained that very simple. You just have the money to spend in structure. I mean, you just have to cover an area, and then everything has to happen inside, and exploring that with double heights or spaces that can occur and can change within the same frame.
You know, something that I don't know if this is kind of as a theme that I thought your question kind of incites is that in contrast to the last group, which was kind of thinking from the outside, you know, the master plan to the house, eventually to the unit. It seems like, I mean, at least what I was trying to make a case, and I think that in your presentations as well, that the concern is like, well, how do people live, and what is the relationship between the user and the house, or even the user and the furniture, or the user and their sense of space, and then, you know, you start to kind of create the walls and the environment in order to kind of, and then, you know, then it multiplies. And then you figure out what the master plan for it is, which I don't know if that's the best thing, but you know, so that there's a kind of an aggregate where you actually start with the traditions, with the use, I mean, because everything of that has to do with some kind of relationship with the outside. That seems to be kind of like at the first kind of thought.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying, and I was like even linking to the previous panel when they were asking about whether the Territorio de Gigantes could turn into sort of like a set of rules or not. I think by doing these exercises, by questioning like the typology of housing, what we do, it's like we're really experimenting on how from like from a certain territory, from a certain culture, from a certain traditions, we relate to different ways of inhabiting, different ways of producing or providing ways of living. And I think what we're sort of like questioning at the end of the presentation is how this collectivity could leave behind the idea of possession and start thinking about the sharing spaces and like the approach to a wider idea of like, to a broader idea of how to relate to public space, but also to the conditions that a private space could form or could integrate in terms of community, of neighborhood, of city, of like from the smaller scale growing into the bigger scale. And then it goes back again that of the richness of the typology of housing, that how from the understanding or from this experimentation of questioning how to live, we end up like also constructing or experimenting in the scale of the city and the evolution of culture and history.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I really actually enjoyed the introduction of the idea of like private space and the kind of solitude of private space, because it's of course so central to housing, and at this moment when, you know, we're all talking about, of course, the importance of sharing and the importance of collective space, it's like interesting to kind of return to that. And having visited your office and some of your projects earlier this fall, like I can say that they, in a way, they have the use of the patio or the kind of courtyard. They're very inward. They're also very inward and very focused, and in some cases very cut off, actually, from the city. And so that's, I think it's interesting you bring that in. And then I guess I'm wondering, like, you know, you both, your work is, both of your practices are, of course, not just housing, right? You work in other kind of types. And how much of I'm curious, like, in the experimentation with housing, how much of it would you say is like from typologically driven versus the idea of like other types, thinking and ideas from other types coming into kind of housing? Maybe that's a question also for Fernanda.
I think in my case, it's really based in housing itself. Every time when I research more and more and more on Mexican typologies from the last 100 years, I find more and more examples that deal with housing in different ways, incorporating workspace or productive, even the productive notion of Legorreta's example that Luis mentioned earlier with retail space. And it's the natural condition of how people live, especially in the case for women that are usually the ones in charge of the whole family economy in Mexico. They're in charge of the kids, but they also have to work. So it's a natural condition. So I think the universe is so vast of examples that historically have done that in better ways that architects usually plan for that. Yeah, I think the flexibility issue is so strong that there's no better analysis or examples than the everyday, the vernacular, or the informal solutions. For me, those are like the best examples. Because in the case for Eva Housing, the first project I showed after the earthquake, the program, the first time I visited and knew the owner, Eva, she had just 2 kids and a certain economy, whatever. And then on a future visit, suddenly 2 older kids appeared. Then on another visit, she had a car that she didn't have before. So the families are so complex. Then the sister was supposed to live with her. Then there weren't any grandparents, and suddenly a grandparent appeared. So family-wise, it's so complex that flexibility is not in a couple of years. It's even in the process of designing, and even, I mean, every day conditions change. Even you could say regarding budgets, but also regarding even the neighborhood. So the views, I mean, you're not controlling anything. So I think that what you mentioned, that projects sometimes shut off the context, have to do with that. At least in my case, the only thing that you can control is what happens inside the same frame. So that's what you have to work with.
Yeah, I would say that also probably from other projects what we get influenced by is the idea of how we address the territory. And by territory, not only in terms of the landscape, but probably what Luis was presented with the last case of Carlos Lasso, and these projects that question the morphology of the cave, but also the project is not only questioning that, it's also questioning the idea of like a rooftop, a livable, a livable rooftop, and also the relationship with the courtyard, which is something that we also have very embedded in our culture or tradition. So I guess like how other projects end up influencing in housing is with the relationship towards the landscape, but the landscape beyond its condition of the beauty that could provide, or the contemplation of the space, but of how we relate to the morphology of the construction of different terrains or different territories.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's, I see that also, this kind of connection to big, through very small scale projects, this connection to the kind of bigger scale. I know it's also something that Tatiana has talked about a lot in her work, this kind of relationship between landscape and bigger systems, and I think it's very present, and I love that we're talking about kind of architecture of 50 square meters, yet this kind of larger impact and the sort of city. Should we perhaps open it up for some questions from the audience?
In the future, thinking about the question beyond design, but also to how do you redefine the conditions within which things are built here in such a way that Adam Ferguson to learn from, but I think ultimately the value in looking at these other contexts would be in thinking how can we reshape the kind of political and institutional circumstances within which we're working, such that the students or the faculty here would have equal opportunities in the United States to execute work in housing, in the field of housing at the same scale as you might see in other countries. And Mexico seems to be a particularly salient example today, let's say. So I was wondering, from the experience of perhaps working in Mexico, teaching in the United States, or working in the United States and teaching here and with an international body of students, how we start to have a kind of discussion about the political and institutional conditions within which we're building in such a way that some of these very salient questions, for instance, of developing new housing paradigms or addressing kind of family structures and the demographics for which we're building are able to be dealt with through the actual kind of material act of building things here. So I don't know if that's a fair question, but if there's a possibility of reflecting in a way on how circumstances in Mexico have enabled you to build and how we might rethink the circumstances here in which we aren't able to build in the same way.
Can I suggest a historical answer? Since I don't have a practice. I wish I had a practice like these guys. I think that one of the things that, I mean, as it was already mentioned, the Article 4 of the Mexican Constitution, which is a constitution from 1917 in the middle of the Mexican Revolution, which was trying to correct this disenfranchisement of a huge part of the population that didn't have housing, and they were basically, living in terrible conditions and had this, really bad political situation. I think that this is the beginning of the kind of questioning, and people like Juan Legarreta, the first guy that I talked about, I think he was that was his thesis project, which he built. He was, maybe 19 or 20 years old. And then shortly thereafter, he started building for the state. And this was because there was this need that was associated with the revolution, this radical kind of opening. And I think that still, this kind of in the background, the Mexican Revolution is still this kind of oddly, perhaps maybe subconscious force that people keep bringing up in political discourse that are, it's like people are trying to get away from it, but it's still this thing about the equality of the people and the need for housing, and the Infonavit in a sense is kind of set up within this within this paradigm of thinking. I don't know. I think that's one of the reasons why there's so much and there's so much opportunity, just because there's this need that is regulated by the government and the Constitution.
I agree, but I would say it's a need, a worldwide need. We cannot base it on United States or Mexico. I think, even Mexico, 100 years after that constitutional, after the revolution and the big achievement to put it in the Constitution, still 70% of houses in Mexico are built informally, are illegally made, and are not provided by the government. So we're still not even close to that achievement. And if you think of it worldwide, we're still, we're not being useful to society. So the possibilities of doing projects are every day, they're needed. Obviously, we have to do it with the same velocity and the same budget as the clients, the people need it. But actually, that's, I think, our big, what we still have to do as architects.
I'm also amazed at the kind of quantity of work that you've been able to produce, and I would encourage you, Emma, to stick around for Julia's talk from Infonavit to actually understand the sort of context.
We have studio this afternoon.
Okay. One thing that's actually even more amazing, I think, Fernanda, I discovered that you don't have an office or employees, actually, and so the kind of 8 to 10 projects you've literally produced, kind of on your own in a very direct way on kind of construction sites, and I think that's even more remarkable. So maybe then to kind of turn the question, how do you structure your practices to kind of achieve this type of work?
New York City and its zoning, the relationship of the Department of City Planning and people in New York City and all of the back and forth. What is that situation in Mexico City as to who decides or makes the rules as to what can be built where?
I think in Mexico there are a lot of organizations and institutions that are responsible of that decisions of zoning, and in most of the cases they are consulted or concealed with neighbors of each part of the city. Not always it's like in the way that we desire to be, because sometimes there's a lot of interest that are pushing things behind maybe the curtains of these institutions, and it could be it could really create changes in those zonings. But most of the cases, and in the places where community is very well organized, it's very difficult now to really go behind them. So they have to approve everything that is happening in the zoning changes. And maybe in Mexico City, in my experience, there was one specific moment that really starts changing the political way the city starts doing development, and also how the city was understood. And it's when a Mexican architect that was formerly the dean of UNAM, that was Felipe Leal, when he went the secretary of urban development of the city, that really changed a lot of things, because it was a moment where an architect really starts designing and taking decisions and showing the public that the architectural view of a city could really change. And maybe the further governors of the city had really take that heritage, and most of them are really close to architects when it's convenient for them. When you're not convenient, they just push you aside. But somehow the city really felt that need of an architect.
Thank you so much for a very, very nice panel and set of projects. I appreciate very much this panel in relationship to the one before. I think the one before, there were a couple of very provocative statements. And I think in this second panel, the idea of learning from a group of people, a condition emerge, and rather than teaching to, or kind of laying out a plan for others, emerging a plan from the context. And I think we are in a moment that learning from, or observing and learning rather than teaching and experimenting upon, it's a really important way of thinking about housing. And I also, there are other ways in which we are moving away from what you were saying, Adam, moving away from this idea of kind of a fake idea of sharing, or a kind of collectivity. And people, whether it's in Israel, they're moving away from the kibbutz. In southern Italy, they're moving away from sharing intergenerational housing. And so there are ways in which collectivity emerges from a different standpoint, from a point of introspection, and kind of thinking about certain things that are to be private and certain things that are to be shared. And those things are not necessarily coming from an architectural textbook or from the legacy of European architecture. They're coming from observing more millenary ways in which they're plentiful in Mexico, millenary ways in which that country and culture over millennia has learned to live from a land, build from a land, medical care from a land, and not necessarily importing those things from the outside. So my question to you is, as people that are pivoting between the United States and Mexico, how do you feel about the legacy of international architecture and international style, and the models of housing that so many times come from other places?
How much time do we have? I mean, I think it's one of the huge paradoxes of Mexican architecture that I think Juan O'Gorman, who started off as this radical functionalist. I mean, he Legarreta and Juan O'Gorman were actually collectively designing houses, and Legarreta was working with historians and with poets when they were designing houses. But I think that there's this kind of moment of crisis that that Mexico kind of arrives at in terms of how to deal with like modernism, and the cave things are really kind of a response to that legacy. Although I think one of the things that I was thinking you know, after hearing their presentations is how much faith I have now in Mexican modern housing, because in a sense, what these young people are doing, because they're young, is that they're actually thinking about kind of very consciously about the way that people are living. But then they're also kind of responding to the things from modernism that didn't work. Like, for example, you know, the Miguel Alemán had the nursery and the pools and things like this. And, you know, Legarreta's had the same thing, which are just really kind of like variants of Siedlungen. And they're kind of figuring out how to actually integrate it into the everyday and just like radically kind of transforming, you know, like those relationships between housing and like these other needs that are so necessary for a living.
You know, there really isn't prototypes. It works, you know, that's not the problem. The problem is ownership. If they don't own the units, they sell it. It's as simple as that. If they own it, it succeeds. Now, that's why I need to know, do they own it?
In my case, there are cases where they rent them and others where they own it. There's not a big difference as to the results and neither as to the demands, because actually they change as well even if they own them.
Well, people will take care of things they own.
Yes, I think we agree on that, and maybe in Mexico it's very common to own the apartments. The business of rent is not so profitable than the way of selling houses. So normally the new developments always have to do with selling apartments. So renting becomes like a secondary business, maybe not the main.
Well, thank you very much to our panel.
We're going to now go to our next panel, and Kasim Shepard is going to introduce the speakers and be the moderator for this panel. Kasim is an adjunct assistant professor here in the Urban Design Department. He's also a founder of Urban Omnibus. Thank you, Kasim.
Thank you, Hillary, and thank you, Mr. Cox. You're a personal hero of mine, so that was a great delight to see that. As Hillary mentioned, my name is Kasim Shepard. I teach here at GSAP a number of courses related to narrative and storytelling, particularly through filmmaking, as well as classes on the complex history of the encounter between architecture and poverty. And so I'm delighted to be a part of this conference today and this stimulating day of presentations and discussions, as well as this panel in particular, which kind of brings together both of those aspects of what I look at. The name of this panel is Livability and Design Excellence, but I think we're really trying here to expand notions of quality and excellence beyond what can just be evaluated in aesthetic terms on opening day of a building, but rather to really try and look at how environments evolve and how we might incorporate the experience critically of users, of residents, of workers, the people who inhabit and dwell in the built environments that we create, into that evaluation of how complex built environments work. So we will be joined today by David Brody, who is a professor of design studies at Parsons at the New School. His work, his recent work, focuses on the relationship between design and labor, especially in the context of hotels, and also by Hans Iblings, an architectural historian and critic who teaches at the Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape, and Design at the University of Toronto, and the publisher and editor of the Architecture Observer, and the author of Rise and Sprawl. Rise and Sprawl, The Condominiumization of Toronto. Unfortunately, Lisa Yun Lee, who's the executive director of the Public Housing Museum, the National Public Housing Museum in Chicago, is unable to join us. The blizzard got in the way of her flight from Chicago this morning. When the National Public Housing Museum opens in the last remaining building of the Jane Addams houses, it will be the first cultural institution dedicated to interpreting the American experience in public housing. So I am just going to very briefly cycle through her slides in her absence, just to really make sure, if it's not already, that the National Public Housing Museum is on your radar and that you visit them the next time you're in Chicago. One of the things that Lisa in our conversations leading up to today really emphasized was not only the physical site in the Jane Addams houses that is sort of a repository of memory, but also the deep outreach and public programming the museum has done with constituents, both current and former, of public housing in the Chicago area. This I thought was particularly poignant in light of the Lafayette Park example. And really sort of doing deep outreach to lift up not only the sort of physical environments in which public housing has taken place, but also the personal stories. And I think storytelling and the role of lifting up the narratives of users, I think, is going to be central to any expansion of our conversation about what housing environments and other kinds of complex environments can be. So I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to introduce some of those questions into today's conversation, starting with David Brody, who's going to talk to us a little bit about hotels, labor, and how those can influence how we evaluate these things. David?
Terrific. First of all, thank you for having me, Hillary and Cassim. I very much appreciate it. And I'm going to talk just for about 13, 14 minutes or so today. So my work looks at the ways in which design choices all too often subjugate labor. Specifically, I'm interested in how design decisions, which directly affect the physical and economic well-being of housekeepers, get made really without any regard for the difficult nature of what Hilary Sample describes as cleaning-focused work. Since the majority of hotel housekeepers in the United States are women of color, I contend that there is a racially motivated discourse about hotel workers and a type of cultural disparagement towards what many perceive as the menial nature of these jobs that is implicit in these unfortunate design decisions. This approach to design explicitly affects these women's daily lives, and part of what this book project was about was interviewing housekeepers and trying to get at those narratives that was just spoken about. So let's enter one of these hotels I studied. Let's check in, if you will, to a conflict that arose at the Hyatt Regency Chicago 8 years ago. This conflict was a result of the lapsed contract between Hyatt management and its Chicago hotel workers represented by Unite Here, which is the big hotel union in the United States. The hotel workers' previous contract went into force on September 1st, 2006, and expired on August 31st, 2009. From 2009 until the ratification of a new contract in 2013, those represented by the union, including the housekeeping staff and many of those in the food and beverage department of the hotel, worked without a contract. This meant a protracted series of conflicts centered on wages and conditions and benefits. So yes, finances and benefits were critical to these labor talks and disputes that went on for 4 years in Chicago. But housekeepers also protested the recent physical changes to the interior that made their jobs much more demanding. So starting with the west tower of the hotel and then moving to the east tower, the Hyatt Regency Chicago completed the renovation of its 2,019 rooms in 2011. And typically, whenever I talk about the Regency, inevitably there's several people in the room who have stayed at the hotel because it's so enormous and it's such a convention-centric spot. While the guest desires were clearly the driving force behind these design changes, the voices of hotel workers, especially housekeepers, were not included in the design process. The firm Indie Design, based in California, led the $90 million renovation. And I interviewed Beatrice Gorelli, the firm's principal and owner, and her conversation with me, I think, helped shed some light on both their design brief from Hyatt and some of the challenges that went into their enormous project. Gorelli was very open about the tension that exists between corporations like Hyatt and a more ambitious design vision. Often this had to do with finances, and these limitations can affect creativity, since Gorelli's firm does what it can to push the possibility of design into territory that will, in her words, wow the guest. During my interview with Gorelli, she was frank about housekeeping and concerns that her firm has with the women who clean the spaces she has designed. She noted, quote, "We design things that fit in only one place, which makes certain that the room is housekeeping proof." She emphasized that there are many hotels where housekeeping, quote, is the designer, As they move objects, they do not follow the manuals that design firms give to hotels, and they disregard the importance of appearance. To avoid this, Gorelli and her team keep a careful record of where each object should be placed and create a manual for housekeeping, which I was never able to get my hands on, unfortunately, that gives explicit directions about where objects should be kept. So here's a before and after shot, obviously the before on top and the after on the bottom of the renovation. Indy Design's changes at the Regency focused on palette, fixtures, and textures found in the guest rooms. The bed and pillows in the old rooms were multicolored, with large vertical light fixtures that were part of the wood headboards. A grid-like pattern defined the overall appearance of the earlier rooms, while Gorelli's new rooms are more monochromatic and less accented, with tones of brown. The new lighting fixtures are subtle, and the furniture has cleaner lines without the cluttered look that must have led to the decision to renovate. This is a before and after of the bathroom. The bathrooms extend this motif of cleaner lines with new sinks and vanities in the absence of towel racks. The sinks are now set within a wood base, and underneath the sink there are 3 towels, you can see that on the right, that instead of hanging from a rack are rolled and tucked out of a line of sight, which would be unavoidable with towel racks. Instead of the sink surface extending over the back of the toilet to create a ledge for bathroom products, Indy Design uses a simple ledge where the Hyatt's bath amenities can be placed. In several of the hotel's images of the renovation that appeared at the time, a small bamboo plant, like what you see on the right, sits in a glass jar on the sink, adding to the overall spa-like aesthetic that defines the renovation. So not all of the housekeepers at the Hyatt embraced this renovation, and many noted in the interviews that I had with them that the changes have led to injuries and other difficulties. Several of the housekeepers explained that the new mattresses in the room are heavier and difficult to maneuver, especially in terms of tucking in bottom sheets. And in the hotel industry, mattresses and beds are always the most controversial object. Specifically, they've become remarkably more heavy, especially over the course of the last decade, and hotels do not use fitted sheets like probably we all do in our home. There's a phobia against fitted sheets in the hotel industry. So Gorelli from InDesign noted that Hyatt bought these beds without the consultation of her firm, but the position of the bed, which her firm did devise, is also a point of contention between housekeeping and Hyatt's management. As Anne Small-Gonzalez, who was a floor runner in housekeeping, remarked to me, quote, "The bed is so close to the wall in order to get that tuck, it's so uncomfortable. I think that's how a lot of people might be getting hurt." They did make changes with that. Another housekeeper, Angela Martinez, further claimed that placing the mattress on a wooden box rather than a box spring, which was in the old rooms, also makes the bed-making process far more difficult, since the box spring was more flexible than the wooden platform. The new bed also has more pillows than the previous bed. There are now 6 pillows, according to several of the housekeepers I interviewed. And these fluffier pillows are longer and require more reaching and extending of the housekeeper's arm to place the pillow in its case. And many have complained that this also has led to shoulder and back pain. So another seemingly benign design choice, all these kind of seemingly benign design choices in Chicago meant further complications for the hotel workers at the Hyatt. For instance, the new updated bathrooms have also led to more work. Some of the bathrooms have glass partitions that separate the tub from the rest of the bathroom, and many of the rooms that have shower curtains, like the one that you're seeing here, no longer use a plastic liner. So housekeepers have to scrub the white surface that shows even a minuscule amount of dirt. Also, since the towel racks had been removed, housekeepers had to now roll towels and place them underneath the counter below the sink. The towels are hidden from view, achieving the type of clean line aesthetics found throughout the renovated rooms, but by using a napkin as a model, one housekeeper revealed how exacting the rolling process is and how much longer it takes than folding a towel and placing it on a rack. And so all of these small labor changes added up to a tremendous additional time in terms of the amount of the work going into each room. So the design decisions created a very tense work atmosphere at the Hyatt Regency Chicago that in part led to the workers taking action. And on May 26, 2010, about 400 employees walked out of the hotel for a brief period of time to protest issues related to the workload increase caused by the renovation. Hyatt and Unite Here's inability to resolve a contract dispute exacerbated this issue, of course, and a controversy about the hotel management's refusal to allow a particular union representative into the hotel during a particularly heated moment only made the situation worse. The walkout only lasted a few brief hours, but the stage was set for what continued to be a protracted contract negotiation that had, for several employees, an enormous impact. In studying this untenable situation amongst the workers, the union, and Hyatt management, it became apparent that something had to change. And then finally, in August of 2013, Hyatt and its employees did reach an agreement at its 4 Chicago hotels, including the Regency, and signed a contract that was in force until this year. And actually, there was a whole other recent labor dispute that took place this year, which is a subject of a different topic, but closely related to this, of course. As a result of the 2013 contract, housekeepers would get a $1.80 raise per hour, taking their pay to $16.40. And there were also some additional benefits in terms of what the union could protest against and bring up in meetings, and also some slight changes to health benefits. But while many of the pressing concerns appear to have been resolved, there was still really the matter of design. There are still the difficulties associated with contending with guest rooms that have not been designed to facilitate the hard work of housekeeping. So design should be a democratic process. As Guy Bonsiepi has argued, design has now become too entrenched in the spectacle of a media event. Instead of focusing on intelligent solutions, design has, quote, drawn nearer to the ephemeral, fashionable, and quickly obsolete. This has led to the boutiquization of the universe of products for everyday life. While Bonsiepi does not mention hotels specifically, his argument is certainly applicable as hotel chains like Hyatt redesign their rooms not with design solutions in mind, but with the idea of keeping up appearances that will look fashionable. Bonsiepi wants the design community to move away from this unsustainable model and move towards what he describes as a sense of participation, so that, quote, dominated citizens transform themselves into subjects, opening a space for self-determination. This ability to creatively instill self-determination is at the heart of Bonsiepi's larger wish for an emancipative type of design that will foster less subjugation in the face of a design establishment so enamored with the seductive power of manipulating users with and through design. And one way that I am a big fan of in terms of changing some of the nature of the way this works in an industry like the hotel industry, but I think this could be extended into a lot of the topics that we're focusing on today in terms of housing, is by embracing this idea of co-design. And Elizabeth Sanders and Peter Jan Strappers describe co-design as a subversion of what designers usually accept as best practices. In co-design, the person who will eventually be served through the design process is given the position of expert of his or her experience and plays a large role in knowledge development, idea generation, and concept development. They still claim that the role of the professional designer is important, but in their model, the designer cannot do his or her job without input from the individuals who will have to utilize the product or system being produced. Sanders and Strappers also understand that the design process is not a linear narrative. Ideas, concepts, prototypes, and products do not come to the fore in a logical way, I think, as we all know. However, they claim that with more of an inclusive process, quote, what is being designed will change. Imagine then a scenario at the Hyatt Regency Chicago where housekeepers, management, and potential guests work together to come up with design solutions. This form of co-design could include conversations about the current rooms that raise questions about what design choices work and what design choices could be improved upon. Perhaps, for instance, a housekeeper could explain to Beatrice Gorelli how the weight of the mattress in relation to its placement on a non-flexible bed frame makes it very difficult to change the sheets. In reaction to this, the housekeepers and the designers could come up with novel solutions for different types of mattresses and frames that would enable rooms to look presentable without causing the hardships described by so many of the housekeepers I interviewed. Designers, managers, union organizers, and workers all appear to be having conversations without actually talking to one another. Anne Small Gonzalez, one of the housekeepers I interviewed at the Regency, summarized labor's position eloquently. She said, quote, management doesn't listen to their people. They don't take that into consideration, that people are actually getting hurt from doing what they are doing in these rooms. and that the changes that are made are affecting people's lives. In order to get both sides to listen, changes have to occur that will enable this dialogue to take place. Thinking about design as a democratic process with myriad voices ultimately makes the process more complex, but this also has the potential to make the process equitable to both bodies and minds. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm extremely happy to be here, so thank you, Hillary, for inviting me. At the same time, I'm also slightly embarrassed that what I'm going to tell is extremely frivolous in the light of what we've been discussing so far. It's kind of wealthy people problem, the rise and sprawl of condo towers in Toronto. As a relatively new arrival in Canada, I've been completely puzzled and surprised by the transformation of Toronto over the last few years. And let me see if it works. This is the difference between 50 years. That's a lot, but I can tell you, around the turn of the century, most of what you see here was still not built. So I made a book about this with a disclaimer. Now I have 3 copies of the book, which is perfect for this room, so I will hand them out here and you can all take a look. If you really like the book, I'm probably you can buy it. So don't get copies back, I'm expecting one. But what I want to do today is say something about this transformation of Toronto with this one particular building type of the condo tower. And I know that the book, which I made together with Partisans, an architectural office in Toronto, who is responsible, for instance, for this bar, this book has caused quite a bit of grief and anger among developers and architects, which was surprising to me, because the book is simply observing what's going on, and it's describing it in a very neutral way, I believe, by making a sort of a catalog. And I'm going to show you part of the catalog. So my first visit to Toronto was in the 1990s, when I thought it was a nice but rather sleepy place. And when I came back 7 years ago, I found a very exciting, lively, vibrant city. So the paradox for me is that this transformation from mid-70s to this, the city has become extremely interesting for its cultural life, for its city life, but the architecture is amazingly bland and uninteresting. And this paradox, exciting on street level, boring as soon as you look up, is something that is the reason why I decided to make this book. So this overall sameness is, for instance, visible in the exterior colors of the buildings, which range from dark gray to light gray and from greenish gray to grayish green. And we analyzed this, and here you see a selection of buildings, and you can see that the most adventurous designers of condo towers use a little bit of red and a little bit of green, and that's about it. And it's just one example of the sameness and blandness of these buildings. The city of Toronto has imposed a new system of depicting projects which are in the making. So you have to make this notice board, and you have to follow a template for how to depict the building. And it really worked well because it shows this sameness even more. And this is, of course, the perfect example, the template for this notice board, where you can see that it is indeed not very exceptional. And in this respect, speaking here on a day which is dealing with new paradigms, and in a panel which is about design excellence, I think I'm slightly out of place. The sameness is not limited to the design of condo towers, but also to its promotion And here we see a collection of slogans which are used to promote condo towers, new projects. And the most striking thing here is obviously that architecture is completely absent. They speak about many things, but not about architecture. What is striking as well for me is that those buildings, those condo towers, are completely interchangeable. They display an amazing indifference to their site and their context, to the city and to its history. Even if they try to include existing architecture, they do it in a way which is only a Potemkin version of history, according to me. The architecture is underwhelmingly present. It falls between the cracks of the spreadsheet at the beginning and the branding strategy at the end, which speaks about everything but architecture. And here you see how this sameness also is reflected in floor plans, which are extremely small. And in the light of the discussion of this morning, speaking about Mexico, the price of 1 square meter in Toronto is similar to a whole unit in Mexico. And the amount of inventiveness in 1 square meter in Mexico, I think, is the same as the whole unit here. So we just made a selection of floor plans and put them all together. And I'm just moving forward to what's maybe my favorite part, this so-called 1 bedroom plus den. A den is, in most condo towers, a room without a window, which is often used and rented out as a second bedroom. And here you see why some of the small units have 2 bathrooms to allow for this renting out. There is obviously a legal difference between condos and apartments, but this is hard to maintain in Toronto, where somewhere between 25 and 40% of all the units which are privately owned are actually rented out. The best category I kept for the end is the leftovers in every single building, and these are my favorites by far. In the light of a tradition of 50 years of housing design studio here at this school, I think nobody would get a high pass for anything like this. I have a European background and I don't want to be Eurocentric, but it's striking that some of the best projects so far, which are maybe the real exceptions, and they are of recent date, are designed by European, in this case Danish architects, where you can see this project is on its way, and the same for 2 projects by 3XN, which I believe stand out as much better than the average in Toronto. They are invited because there is an obsession with design excellence, even though it's almost absent in those condo towers. And there is an obsession with branding, and Danish architects work for this idea of branding, and the same is true for Karel Lagerfeld. And this is a particular case where an existing design for a condo tower has got a bit of touches of genius from Karel Lagerfeld, who was asked to design the lobby and 1 model suite. As you can see here, these are the lobbies. The most important thing was maybe not so much his design, but his presence at the party, which was really like a big event with great slogans as well. This one is great for someone who's always dressed in black. And here we see the master himself in this model suite, which he transformed from a cramped unit into a cramped unit with black and white details, which is somewhere like 10 feet wide, and as you can see, at least 10 feet high, which is part of the narrative of branding, that you have floor-to-ceiling luxury if you have anything that's 10 feet high. This is more or less the context in which architecture does not exist, you can say, in condo towers, where a loft is an excuse for not properly finishing anything, or an excuse for making units even smaller than they were. In that sense, there is some sort of limitation in the quality of those units. A bit of background, because every novelty makes its causes new. One key moment was the creation of the Condominium Act, the end of the 1960s, which made it possible to sell units or to have shared ownership of land. So that was the first step. The second one was 1995, when there was a referendum on Quebec independence, which was a big thing in Canada, which was rejected by a razor-thin majority, and which gave enough companies headquartered in Montreal the creeps, and then prompted them to move to Toronto, and this was the beginning of this transition from a sleepy town to a bustling city. The third factor is Canada mostly escaped the economic crisis with a mix of good luck and smart policy and the proverbial Canadian risk aversion. And it meant that the Canadian real estate market benefited from the crisis elsewhere, and it became a safe haven for parking your capital. And particularly in condo towers, you can see an enormous increase in the value of property from around 150,000 Canadian dollars in 2000 to more than 600 today. And at the same time, the sizes of the units got smaller and smaller. One of the striking things is what you see: 1 bedroom, 2 bedrooms, bottom left. Here you see something striking as well. You see this peak and this graph at the top, people with high income. So basically the inhabitants of condo, those condo towers are single, high income, highly educated people. This one is striking and deserves more of a kind of research perhaps, is that most of the inhabitants from in condos used to live in detached or semi-detached houses. So this shows, it's an indication at least, that it's a return from the suburbs to the city. And the suburban background of many condo dwellers is somehow reflected in what you see in downtown Toronto nowadays. There's the arrival of large chain stores with, which you used to find in suburban malls, but are now present in the city as well. So it hints at a suburbanization of the center of Toronto. Then 2 names collected to this development in a very oblique way: George Baird and Jane Jacobs. Architect and educator George Baird was one of the makers of Vacant Lottery, a special issue of the Design Quarterly of the Walker Art Center, in which he analyzed, together with Jack Diamond and Barton Myers, the, let's say, the presence of all those vacant lots in the center of Toronto and the possibility to transform them. And this is a drawing at the right from this special issue, which is a bit ambiguous. It was meant to show that you could actually turn a high-rise into a dense low-rise project, but I think one way of reading it is also to see the other way around, so kind of argument for what happened actually in Toronto recently. The other one, other person that should be mentioned is Jane Jacobs, who left, as you probably all know, she left New York City to continue her work in Toronto in the late 1960s. And she has an enormous reputation in Toronto still today. She's somehow the patron saint of pedestrian urbanism. And in Toronto, they've invented the Jane's Walk, 1 year after she died. And you don't have to be Roman Catholic to see the, let's say, procession-like character of those Jane's walks. She's always often invoked in Toronto whenever a designer wants to prove that they've done something well by saying that she would have proved it. Usually it's about walkability, about neighborhoods and whatnot. But as a firm believer in free markets, I think developers could also claim that what they are doing is something that Jane would have approved of. I'm, let's say, not completely confident in the relevance of some of her statements. And I think they have a sort of slogan-like character. And some of those slogans have become dating conversation material, as you can see here. So I don't know to which extent we can still discuss this seriously in architectural context. George Baird, by the way, completely disagrees with me on this point. He read the book and he said afterwards, the book is actually better than I thought it was. I don't know whether it's a compliment or a swipe, but that's his. And he said I was completely wrong about Jane Jacobs. I come to a conclusion. If you suspend all disbelief and assume that the free market is working well, then it's hard to avoid the conclusion that the free market does not work well for architecture. Moreover, speaking with several architects and developers before and after writing the book, I noticed that nobody's really happy with the situation. And it seems that everybody feels that they are part of a movie and they are in this Mexican standoff, pointing their guns at each other. Developers claim that they have to do what the market demands. Real estate agents force them to offer certain things. Architects claim that they have to do what developers demand, and buyers are simply buying what's available, thinking that as long as it looks like everything else, they will be able to sell it with a decent profit at some point. For me, as an architectural historian and a critic, I can feel completely an outsider in this, unable to influence anything. And I'm not saying that those recent developments by the invitation of Danish architects is leading to anything directly connected to what I've been saying, but there's at least one reason to believe that there is some power in the written word, because shortly after the book was published, a group of architects mentioned in the book gathered with a lawyer to see if there was enough reason to start a libel case against me. I'm extremely happy that the lawyer advised them not to do it, because that's why I'm still here. But it shows that there is maybe some power in making a book and offering a narrative, offering a reading of something which I think is extremely disappointing. With all the money available, I believe that Toronto could do something much better. Thank you.
But for the moment, I'd like to start and get a little bit academic just for a moment before we reconnect to real life, which your presentations both evoke in great detail. And I'd love it if you guys could talk a little bit about your distinct methodologies. I mean, David, you're talking about really an ethnography here and using sort of an American studies, anthropological, ethnographic series of processes to really unpack the lived experience of taking care of these environments. And Hans, as a critic, you know, you're talking about this in a context that really is in dialogue with a canonical architectural history, as well as the way in which you've uncovered some of the, you know, the legal things in terms of the Condominium Act and some of the context of specific figures that have left this. Led to the situation we now see in Toronto. Our panel is the only one today that is not being sort of the presentation of design propositions or planning proposals. So I'm, as I mentioned in the intro, excited to foreground, both storytelling as well as other qualitative, experiential methods of inquiry. And you guys are both educators too. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit about your own sort of methodologies and also why you think those methodologies are important to teach the designers of the future and how that might influence design education, especially for those who are considering going on to dealing with some of these, social problems that we're hearing about today.
Well, for me, I'm trained as an architectural historian, but I also did archaeology, and for me, this whole idea of classifying things.
Speak into your mic a little more closely.
Classifying, structuring, categorizing things is really helpful to understand what's going on. And I think it worked well in the case of those condo towers because many times developers and architects suggest that it's highly original what they're doing, but if you see it all next to each other, you see they're all the same. And we also made a point, as you can see in the book, if it's still going around here, we collected all the statements from architects, from their websites, all their claims, what they are doing. And I think that's the main reason why they were upset, because if you see all the, let's say, design statements and missions of all the websites together, completely interchangeable. So in that sense, it works for me to use this kind of old school archaeological methods of classification to understand what is going on.
I loved the emphasis on the marketing slogans as well. There was one that seemed particularly ironic that was like, you're not one of a crowd, you make all your own decisions and are a highly original thinker or something like that.
Well, my favorite, I don't think we included it, but one of my favorite is a project where they said, let's say, this unique selling point was that it was an iconic address.
David, could you speak a little bit about your methods, ethnography, interviews,
Sure.
and the role that plays in design education today?
Yeah, so my background is in American studies, but I've taught in mostly art history and design history types of contexts. And the work that I did earlier in my career was much more historical, where I would spend the hours upon hours in places like the library here, for example, for the project that I did on American Empire in the Philippines. And this was a departure, and this was something that I had never done before. The idea of working with people who are living was a new avenue. But being able to interview subjects, I think, brought out elements of design that I had not considered before. So part of the project looks at these greenwashing programs that happen in hotels. When you check into a hotel and you're told that you don't need to get your linen changed or your towels changed, and they'll give you a hotel credit of some sort, make a green choice, which Starwood and Marriott do is probably the most famous one. And on the surface, there's a progressive element to that, right? You're being conscious of sustainability and you're saving on chemicals, but spending time interviewing housekeepers and hearing about how this led to lost wages is not something I ever would have learned without actually having those conversations, I think. And it brought an element to the project which surprised me, which is always nice when research happens in a way that dealing just with documentation did not.
Do you find an increased interest on the part of students to sort of investigate designed environments using that kind of methodology?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, and the idea of interviewing people and having conversations about it is definitely something that students are very interested in. And more of the students, the graduate students that I work with are going in that direction. I mean, there's all kinds of complications with things like IRB approval and the population that you're working with. And whether or not you use subjects' names or not, and what that means. Do you pay subjects? I mean, there's all kinds of ethical issues which I knew nothing about until I started this project, quite frankly. But I learned about. But students are very interested in following that path.
And I think it should definitely work for a research like mine as well, because I always have issues whenever explanations become too abstract when it's about a market.
Right.
Because there's no market, there's just a collection of individuals, and they all take decisions, and together they lead to something. but it's all individuals. And the funny thing is, as soon as you speak to developers and architects, they're basically complaining about the same things, and they feel forced by something abstract, which nobody can name or touch, like the market or the economy or society.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, which speaks to the way in which a lot of the buildings you're talking about are not even housing environments in the sense that we've been talking about today, but are in fact vehicles for speculative capital, which you raise.
But then we're also entering again this abstract level of investment in capital and things like that.
Which also is not only a driver, but it's also an excuse to feel forced into making these kinds of design decisions without a tremendous amount of consideration for the long term. I mean, another thing I really love about the overlap between your presentations, which is also would have been very present in Dr. Lee's presentation too, had she been able to join us, is this notion of thinking at a slightly broader time scheme about some of the questions that you're investigating than is necessarily often the case, certainly in terms of architectural criticism, where we evaluate design excellence only on opening day, and then immediately thereafter it begins to deteriorate, which is why questions of maintenance, questions of stewardship, not only when that's a labor issue, which of course is especially acute in the case of house cleaning staff in hotels, but the way in which we maintain our environments as a form of use, I think is of crucial importance as we think about all different kinds of environments. So, yeah, how does the role of time or the need for long-term inquiry into these complex environments, how do you think that's needs to be, to a greater or lesser degree embraced by design studies more broadly?
Well, it's hard to be against it, to start with.
Well, then how do you do it? How do we encourage a longer time frame of analysis?
Well, I think one of the, it's so obvious, but one of the, let's say, clear advantages of having a historical perspective, of being a historian or whatever, is that that many things that are presented as new are actually not new at all. Mm-hmm. So they have a history. And so whenever I hear people speak about a new generation, I'm always suspicious because I think, okay, what's a new generation? Right.
But it's very hard to break out of. I mean, I am teaching an American art class this semester, right? So it's basically American art, architecture, and design, the way I've constructed the class. But, with architecture, you're often, not always, and I try to break out of it, but you're often just showing the best version of the completed thing without actually thinking about how people are construing that space in different ways. It's what's constructed, and then that's the snapshot that you're showing on the PowerPoint, and then you move on to the next image. Right. Style to style, is frequently the mode of doing it. And I think if there's moments where you could break out of that to try to talk about how people actually use the space, obviously that's something that makes things come alive. It makes things come alive for students, but it's difficult to break out of the mode. I speak for myself personally of sometimes just going building to building or space to space. I try.
Yeah, I can see that. I think another aspect which is important is language. I'm pretty interested in the language around architecture, the language around those projects. And I think even the language here, speaking about design excellence, is really, really intriguing to me. It's almost like when you say that if you have to emphasize it, then it's absent, apparently. So I had a discussion not too long ago with the former planner from Toronto, Jennifer Kiesmaat, and she was speaking about public space in Toronto, and it was all about spectacular and design excellence and award-winning and world-class and things like that, which for me was extremely telling.
Yeah.
And it didn't end well, the discussion, but...
Well, no, I mean, because the way in which the term is most often used is very much as a benchmark or a metric, and essentially it was used as a way to, in a policy context, say, well, let's actually hire architects as opposed to creating the same sort of boxes. In the morning session, Tatiana Bilbao mentioned that for 2 decades, a lot of the social housing in Mexico was, a very sort of formulaic type, and then the introduction of any kind of architectural concern, even if it is only 1% of the buildings, led to a different level of conversation and discourse around that. However, I think you're absolutely right. Having to point that out most often just indicates that it's absent.
No, and of course, there's always an inflation in language, and I don't have any problem with it, but I'm still waiting for the first city that comes with a planning strategy where they say we want to make it good.
Yeah, and Karl Lagerfeld is not necessarily the way to get to, right? That's what I found amazing about those images that you showed. First of all, the term fashion also came up in the list of the slogans that you had, but the images of, Karl creating the lobby and then him in that cramped apartment space with those black plates. I mean, it seemed very on brand for him, of course, dressed in his typical attire, but it's about elevating the status of the space, obviously, for the individuals who are buying the apartment, but it's going beyond the architectural discourse, right? It has to now become this fashion idea, which I really found incredible from a marketing perspective of how that's working in those images. Yeah, I mean, it's a whole other level of narrative.
Absolutely,
yeah. Do you want to do other studies of this kind where you kind of look? I mean, I'm also interested, since you mentioned language, I haven't yet had the opportunity to read the book, but you said that you described it, in a very sort of neutral way, and we're really kind of breaking it down into these, which I mean, I was slightly, I was like, really? Is this a neutral analysis? But I think what you're talking about is that you were deconstructing the elements of the way in which this architectural narrative of a condominium downtown lifestyle is being presented, even though it's a pretty regimented and deterministic form of city life.
No, absolutely. And so one chapter in this catalog is there what we show the renderings of those buildings, and you always see the CN Tower in the background, which is the only way to know that it's actually in Toronto. And if you see them all next to each other, it really becomes funny. It's so silly that every single image has the CN Tower, because it's marketed to people who already are in Toronto in most cases. So there's a kind of endless repetition. So it's not only the language, but it's also the visual language, which is so repetitive. And I think it's intriguing. So there may be more subjects, but now I'm a bit longer in Canada, so I'm going to live according to this motto of better safe than sorry. So I might be more careful in avoiding libel issues.
Speaking of language, David, tell us a little bit more about the content of some of the interviews that you conducted with these house cleaners. Did everyone use very sort of similar language? Was it all about sort of inconvenience and time, or were there other themes that came up that perhaps led to a way of suggesting we could expand the definition of how we evaluate the quality of a designed environment?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the discussions were about time, and a lot of the discussions obviously were about the difficult nature of the work. I was, I'd heard about this, but I was surprised about the number of conversations that led to people talking about injuries, and that's actually been fairly well documented by certain studies, ergonomic studies and other studies that have been done, but hearing about that. And then also a lot of the interviews went into their personal lives. I interviewed a group of women in Hawaii where this Make a Green Choice started, and actually it's now gone in Hawaii. It still exists in other Starwood Marriott properties, but not in Hawaii any longer as a result of the strikes, protests, and engagements that these women were involved with, who I interviewed. But they talked about losing the inability to send remittances to the Philippines. So, for example, the housekeepers that I interviewed in Hawaii, all of them were Filipina, and that wasn't just sort of a bizarre coincidence.
Right.
It's who's doing the work in Hawaii in these hotels. But these long conversations that led to how Make a Green Choice, which I talk about in terms of service design issues and workflow systems and things like that, had other types of ramifications to their personal lives, which I never thought would come up in these interviews. I thought it was only going to really just be about the work and the physical hardship and perhaps the corporeal hardship as well, but I didn't realize that there would be other, I mean, of course, it makes sense that there are, but I was surprised when things like that came up in the context of the interviews. And it was very difficult to get to interview the housekeepers. I initially tried, when I first started the project and got IRB approval, I stood outside the service entrance of the Waldorf Astoria and waited for the women to come out of the hotel, and I handed them my little flyer that I had IRB approval for saying, you know, can I interview you? And I got the most suspicious looks, you know, basically, who's this white guy? Like, he must be a union mole. Why would we possibly speak to him? And so the interviews that I did, and I talk about this in the book, were absolutely set up by the union. And so it's important to put that, you know, on the table that actually was part of the issue.
Which perhaps speaks to why, you know, injury and wages, I mean, these are very much determined.
Yeah, and so there
labor.
were certain conversations that happened where I heard the same tropes, but yet at the same time, there was evidence that was presented to me that was really going on, but I had to be very aware of how it was that I was able to speak to the folks that I was speaking to as well.
I wonder, I mean, I'm just very curious, you know, since Hans, and it does in some of the data you showed towards the end of the presentation about, you know, that's very interesting what kinds of apartments people lived in prior to living in some of these downtown condos. Did you speak to any residents?
I spoke to residents, yes, but on an anecdotal basis, so it's not enough to draw any conclusions. But it seems to promote a kind of anonymous lifestyle. So if I'm visiting friends and if you meet somebody in the elevator, there's never any contact.
Right.
So people seem very introverted living there. And that's maybe further proof of this continuation of this suburban lifestyle where you just shop for the whole week and then your groceries, take them home and you stay in your own bubble.
Yeah, it seems to be part of that kind of global aesthete, you know, that you're tapping into this luxury lifestyle.
Yeah.
That also often has to do with kind of detachment and a sense of cool in those spaces,
and
I think. Yeah, absolutely.
No, but there's another aspect to it, which I think is also interesting, and it's kind of relating to your subject as well, is that in the past, running a household was an activity, and now everything is just effortless and seamless, and in every promotion of housing nowadays, you see people just having a great time. You never see anything which is remotely connected to chores.
Right, the work is invisible.
Yeah.
Right, Carl will even set your table.
Yeah. That's in your case as well. In the hotel, it's they go to great efforts to make it completely invisible.
Absolutely.
We have about 5 minutes left. Are there any questions from the audience? Right here, sir.
So there's a point of view. So there's a certain point of view that would sort of link both of your presentations, and that's the financing point of view. So there's this, you know, any project gets financed, and these kind of projects certainly are money making. The motivation is to make money, and there's a narrative for each one of the projects like this that's written for the bank to convince them that this is a safe investment, that they'll make their money back. And I used to write those narratives, so I know something about them. And on a hotel project like this, it's called the Property Improvement, a PIP, Property Improvement Plan. And it's supposed to include everything that changes. So it's supposed to include the schedule of the construction, it's supposed to include any changes to the room because for labor demands, you know, theoretically should be in that plan and somebody should have evaluated. So you may want to look into that for future research.
That's a great suggestion. If I could get my hands on them, though, that's the only, that sounds like a complicated
they're usually
archive.
Like go from the developer to the bank. So you know, and in the case of the condos, so we used to write these reports. They would be you probably won't be surprised that they're very different for an apartment building that's supposed to be a rental, you know, single owner. Instruments are the ones that are sort of
have the least risk because they're easiest to sell, and they also tend to be the lowest quality because the people who are buying them are not in a position really to evaluate what they're buying. So if you're buying a whole building, if you're an owner, what you know. Yeah.
My question to you is, did you look at, and maybe it's in your book, but I haven't read your book, but I will buy it.
Right.
So two deals. Did you look into the source of them as far as are they being transnational capital?
Yeah, it is transnational, yeah.
And was there something that jumped out at you? You expected the results of your findings, and could you speak a little bit more to that?
It's really hard to get exact numbers on this transnational money. What seems to be clear is that a lot of the money is coming from outside Canada. Field racism in Canada, of units in an apartment and a condo. But there are no, let's say, clear figures for the exact amount of money that is flowing into the market, but it's certainly driven by foreign investment.
Does Toronto have a second home or a vacant home tax? I mean, Vancouver does have a version of that.
I don't know. I cannot give you an answer to that.
That would be interesting to track, because that's a recent thing that in two cities that both have a huge proliferation of condominium towers.
I know it's in Vancouver, but I'm not sure if it's...
There was also the New York Times 2 or 3 years ago. They had a series of articles about who actually owned apartments in the Time Warner condos, and really delved into the LLCs that are buying those spaces. And it was a great investigative report. You should do that.
Yeah. Now, what I know is that the developer of this project by BIC in Toronto, they have on their website. I think it's on their website even. At least they have an overview of their international offices. And they're all in Asia.
Interesting. Does Canada have the equivalent or something similar to the EB-5 visa program in the United States?
Yes.
Do you ever think about how buildings age? You know, in this city, for example, some buildings have aged very well, like the UN building or the Chrysler building. Some have aged very poorly, like the original McGraw-Hill building. I don't know if any of you remember that. The function of the buildings you're describing, the hotels, for example, is for the customers. You know, for the customer to have a good experience and hopefully come back to live in that hotel. How do you blend the two, the form and the function? Designing a bed, you're not designing it so as to break the arms of the cleaners. No. You're designing it to be maximally comfortable for the customer.
Absolutely.
And the third question, is, I think is the most important, is in the mid-'80s, approximately into the 90s, there was a whole field of the anthropology of architecture where they talked about how a bunch of photographs you had during the intermission. There was one of a public housing project. It had 360 on it, that was the address. And there were two people chatting in front of it. You see how poorly designed that was, you know, how people have to adapt to their environment. You know, you're going to socialize no matter how poorly you design your buildings. But you know, the design could facilitate that socialization rather than restrict it. And I was wondering if that is part of your analysis of how buildings are designed, because I don't see that literature anymore. I saw a lot. I'm wondering if you think about it at all.
It's a really, those are great questions. And I agree that the way these hotel rooms are designed is absolutely for the customer, and that's in part my point. Conversation. I think there could be very small design maneuvers, design actions that could make it much more reasonable to workers to work in those spaces, but yet customers could still be happy. You know, in terms of the cost and the bank issue that was brought up as well, my contention is...
But this guy was talking about the PIPs. That's an analyzable question.
It is an analyzable question, but the amount of money that sometimes is spent on labor conflict actually interferes with the profit that the banks would get. And if there was some allowance for a conversation between these different
folks got to use these spaces and clean these spaces and also be guests in these spaces and also manage these spaces and also own these spaces, I think it could potentially stop a lot of the labor conflict that exists all over the hotel industry today.
I mean, part of the discourse in the literature that you're referencing, sir, is environment behavior research, which, and some of the people that you invoked come out of that tradition of environmental psychology and the way in which that was applied to some of the vanguard. I mean, you mentioned service design, you mentioned co-design, and the sort of who are we incorporating into the ways in which we think about design environments. Those, I think, are resurgences of some of that spirit of how can we actually bring some of these social scientific, and I'm sure there's a diversity of the ways in which these homogeneous environments in Toronto are actually used onto these homogeneous environments that I think it takes a lot of work, and it takes ethnographic work and design criticism work, as well as other kinds of competencies to unpack those forces. And so I think that's one of the things.
That work? Is it the planners? Is it the architect? Is it the who does that?
Not enough of us, I think, is the answer. But yes, on the part of students of architecture to look at some of those post-occupancy questions. I don't know if design studies and if Daniel's faculty, if you see similar trends in terms of
what we're doing at Parsons, absolutely. Hopefully, we'll continue to do more of it.
So I think that wraps